Chapter 1. The Haunted Bookshop. If you are ever in Brooklyn, that borough of superb sunsets and magnificent vistas of husband-propelled baby carriages, it is to be hoped you may chance upon a quiet by-street where there is a very remarkable bookshop. This bookshop, which does business under the unusual name Parnassus at Home, is housed in one of the comfortable old brownstone dwellings which have been the joy of several generations of plumbers and cockroaches. The owner of the business has been at pains to remodel the house to make it a more suitable shrine for his trade, which deals entirely in secondhand volumes. There is no secondhand bookshop in the world more worthy of respect. It was about 6 o'clock of a cold November evening, with gusts of rain splattering upon the pavement, when a young man proceeded uncertainly along Gissing Street, stopping now and then to look at shop windows as though doubtful of his way. At the warm and shining face of a French rotisserie, he halted to compare the number enameled on the transom with a memorandum in his hand. Then he pushed on for a few minutes, at last reaching the address he sought. Over the entrance his eye was caught by the sign, Parnassus at Home R. and H. Mifflin Book Lovers Welcome. This shop is haunted. He stumbled down the 3 steps that led into the dwelling of the Muses, lowered his overcoat collar, and looked about. It was very different from such bookstores as he had been accustomed to patronize. 2 stories of the old house had been thrown into one. The lower space was divided into little alcoves. Above, a gallery ran round the wall, which carried books to the ceiling. The air was heavy with the delightful fragrance of mellowed paper and leather surcharged with a strong bouquet of tobacco. In front of him he found a large placard in a frame. This shop is haunted by the ghosts of all great literature and hosts. We sell no fakes or trashes. Lovers of books are welcome here. No clerks will babble in your ear. Please smoke, but don't drop ashes. Browse as long as you like. Prices of all books plainly marked. If you want to ask questions, you'll find the proprietor where the tobacco smoke is thickest. We pay cash for books. We have what you want, though you may not know you want it. Malnutrition of the reading faculty is a serious thing. Let us prescribe for you. By R. and A. Propers. Propers. The shop had a warm and comfortable obscurity, a kind of drowsy dusk, stabbed here and there by bright cones of yellow light from green-shaded electrics. There was an all-pervasive drift of tobacco smoke, which eddied and fumed under the glass lamp shades. Passing down a narrow aisle between the alcoves, the visitor noticed that some of the compartments were wholly in darkness. In others, where lamps were glowing, he could see a table and chairs. In one corner, under a sign lettered Essays, an elderly gentleman was reading, with a face of fanatical ecstasy illumined by the sharp glare of electricity. But there was no wreath of smoke about him, so the newcomer concluded he was not the proprietor. As the young man approached the back of the shop, the general effect became more and more fantastic. On some skylight far overhead he could hear the rain drumming. But otherwise the place was completely silent, peopled only, so it seemed, by the gurgitating whirls of smoke and the bright profile of the essay reader. It seemed like a secret fane, some shrine of curious rites, and the young man's throat was tightened by a stricture which was half agitation and half tobacco. Towering above him into the gloom were shelves and shelves of books, darkling toward the roof. He saw a table with a cylinder of brown paper and twine, evidently where purchases might be wrapped, but there was no sign of an attendant. This place may indeed be haunted, he thought, perhaps by the delighted soul of Sir Walter Raleigh, patron of the weed, but seemingly not by the proprietors. His eyes, searching the blue and vaporous vistas of the shop, were caught by a circle of brightness that shone with a curious egg-like luster. It was round and white, gleaming in the sheen of a hanging light, a bright island in a surf of tobacco smoke. He came more close, and found it was a bald head. This head, he then saw, surmounted a small, sharp-eyed man who sat tilted back in a swivel chair, in a corner which seemed the nerve center of the establishment. The large pigeon-holed desk in front of him was piled high with volumes of all sorts, with tins of tobacco and newspaper clippings and letters. An antiquated typewriter, looking something like a harpsichord, was half buried in sheets of manuscript. The little bald-headed man was smoking a corncob pipe and reading a cookbook. "I beg your pardon," said the caller pleasantly. "Is this the proprietor?" Mr. Roger Mifflin, the proprietor of Parnassus at home, looked up, and the visitor saw that he had keen blue eyes, a short red beard, and a convincing air of competent originality. "It is," said Mr. Mifflin. "Anything I can do for you?" "My name is Aubrey Gilbert," said the young man. "I am representing the Gray Matter Advertising Agency. I want to discuss with you the advisability of your letting us handle your advertising account, prepare a snappy copy for you, and place it in large circulation mediums. Now the war's over, you ought to prepare some constructive campaign for bigger business." The bookseller's face beamed. He put down his cookbook, blew an expanding gust of smoke, and looked up brightly. "My dear chap," he said, "I don't do any advertising." "Impossible!" cried the other, aghast as at some gratuitous indecency. "Not in the sense you mean. Such advertising as benefits me most is done for me by the snappiest copywriters in the business." "I suppose you refer to whitewash and gilt," said Mr. Gilbert wistfully. "Not at all. The people who are doing my advertising are Stevenson, Browning, Conrad, and Company." "Dear me," said the Gray Matter solicitor, "I don't know that agency at all. Still, I doubt if their copy has more pep than ours." "I don't think you get me. I mean that my advertising is done by the books I sell. If I sell a man a book by Stevenson or Conrad, a book that delights or terrifies him, that man and that book become my living advertisements." "But that word-of-mouth advertising is exploded," said Gilbert. "You can't get distribution that way. You've got to keep your trademark before the public." "By the bones of Tauchnitz," cried Mifflin. "Look here, you wouldn't go to a doctor, a medical specialist, and tell him he ought to advertise in papers and magazines? A doctor is advertised by the bodies he cures. My business is advertised by the minds I stimulate. And let me tell you that the book business is different from other trades. People don't know they want books. I can see just by looking at you that your mind is ill for lack of books, but you are blissfully unaware of it. People don't go to a bookseller until some serious mental accident or disease makes them aware of their danger. Then they come here. For me to advertise would be about as useful as telling people who feel perfectly well that they ought to go to the doctor. Do you know why people are reading more books now than ever before? Because the terrific catastrophe of the war has made them realize that their minds are ill. The world was suffering from all sorts of mental fevers and aches and disorders, and never knew it. Now our mental pangs are only too manifest. We are all reading, hungrily, hastily, trying to find out, after the trouble is over, what was the matter with our minds. The little bookseller was standing up now, and his visitor watched him with mingled amusement and alarm. "You know," said Mifflin, "I am interested that you should have thought it worthwhile to come in here. It reinforces my conviction of the amazing future ahead of the book business. But I tell you that future lies not merely in systematizing it as a trade. It lies in dignifying it as a profession. It is small use to jeer at the public for craving shoddy books, quack books, untrue books. Physician, cure thyself. Let the bookseller learn to know and revere good books. He will teach the customer. The hunger for good books is more general and more insistent than you would dream. But it is still in a way subconscious. People need books, but they don't know they need them. Generally, they are not aware that the books they need are in existence." "Why wouldn't advertising be the way to let them know?" asked the young man, rather acutely. My dear chap, I understand the value of advertising, but in my own case it would be futile. I am not a dealer in merchandise but a specialist in adjusting the book to the human need. Between ourselves, there is no such thing, abstractly, as a good book. A book is good only when it meets some human hunger or refutes some human error. A book that is good for me would very likely be punk for you. My pleasure is to prescribe books for such patients as drop in here and are willing to tell me their symptoms. Some people have let their reading faculties decay, so that all I can do is hold a post-mortem on them, but most are still open to treatment. There is no one so grateful as the man to whom you have given just the book his soul needed, and he never knew it. No advertisement on earth is as potent as a grateful customer. I will tell you another reason why I don't advertise, he continued. In these days when everyone keeps his trademark before the public, as you call it, not to advertise is the most original and startling thing one can do to attract attention. It was the fact that I do not advertise that drew you here. And everyone who comes here thinks he has discovered the place himself. He goes and tells his friends about the book asylum run by a crank and a lunatic, and they come here in turn to see what it is like. I should like to come here again myself and browse about, said the advertising agent. I should like to have you prescribe for me. The first thing needed is to acquire a sense of pity. The world has been printing books for 450 years, and yet gunpowder still has a wider circulation. Never mind. Printer's ink is the greater explosive. It will win. Yes, I have a few of the good books here. There are only about 30,000 really important books in the world. I suppose about 5,000 of them were written in the English language, and 5,000 more have been translated. You are open in the evenings? Until 10 o'clock. A great many of my best customers are those who are at work all day and can only visit bookshops at night. The real book lovers, you know, are generally among the humbler classes. A man who is impassioned with books has little time or patience to grow rich by concocting schemes for cozening his fellows. The little bookseller's bald pate shone in the light of the bulb hanging over the wrapping table. His eyes were bright and earnest. His short red beard bristled like wire. He wore a ragged brown Norfolk jacket from which 2 buttons were missing. A bit of a fanatic himself, thought the customer, but a very entertaining one. Well, sir, he said, I am ever so grateful to you. I'll come again. Good night. And he started down the aisle for the door. As he neared the front of the shop, Mr. Mifflin switched on a cluster of lights that hung high up, and the young man found himself beside a large bulletin board covered with clippings, announcements, circulars, and little notices written on cards in a small neat script. The following caught his eye. RX. If your mind needs phosphorus, try Trivia by Logan Pearsall Smith. If your mind needs a whiff of strong air, blue and cleansing, from hilltops and primrose valleys, try The Story of My Heart by Richard Jefferies. If your mind needs a tonic of iron and wine, and a thorough rough and tumbling, try Samuel Butler's Notebooks, or The Man Who Was Thursday by Chesterton. If you need all manner of Irish, and a relapse into irresponsible freakishness, try The Demigods by James Stephens. It is a better book than one deserves or expects. It's a good thing to turn your mind upside down now and then, like an hourglass, to let the particles run the other way. One who loves the English tongue can have a lot of fun with a Latin dictionary. Roger Mifflin. Human beings pay very little attention to what is told them unless they know something about it already. The young man had heard of none of these books prescribed by the practitioner of bibliotherapy. He was about to open the door when Mifflin appeared at his side. Look here, he said, with a quaint touch of embarrassment. I was very much interested by our talk. I'm all alone this evening. My wife is away on a holiday. Won't you stay and have supper with me? I was just looking up some new recipes when you came in. The other was equally surprised and pleased by this unusual invitation. Why, that's very good of you, he said. Are you sure I won't be intruding? Not at all, cried the bookseller. I detest eating alone. I was hoping someone would drop in. I always try to have a guest for supper when my wife is away. I have to stay at home, you see, to keep an eye on the shop. We have no servant, and I do the cooking myself. It's great fun. Now you light your pipe and make yourself comfortable for a few minutes while I get things ready. Suppose you come back to my den. On a table of books at the front of the shop, Mifflin laid a large card lettered, "Proprietor at supper. If you want anything, ring this bell." Beside the card, he placed a large old-fashioned dinner bell and then led the way to the rear of the shop. Behind the little office in which this unusual merchant had been studying his cookbook, a narrow stairway rose on each side, running up to the gallery. Behind these stairs, a short flight of steps led to the domestic recesses. The visitor found himself ushered into a small room on the left, where a grate of coals glowed under a dingy mantelpiece of yellowish marble. On the mantel stood a row of blackened corncob pipes and a canister of tobacco. Above was a startling canvas in emphatic oils, representing a large blue wagon drawn by a stout white animal, evidently a horse. A background of lush scenery enhanced the forceful technique of the limner. The walls were stuffed with books. Two shabby, comfortable chairs were drawn up to the iron fender, and a mustard-colored terrier was lying so close to the glow that a smell of singed hair was sensible. "There," said the host, "this is my cabinet, my chapel of ease. Take off your coat and sit down." "Really," began Gilbert, "I'm afraid this is—" "Nonsense. Now you sit down and commend your soul to Providence and the kitchen stove. I'll bustle round and get supper." Gilbert pulled out his pipe, and with a sense of elation prepared to enjoy an unusual evening. He was a young man of agreeable parts, amiable and sensitive. He knew his disadvantages in literary conversation, for he had gone to an excellent college where glee clubs and theatricals had left him little time for reading. But still he was a lover of good books, though he knew them chiefly by hearsay. He was 25 years old, employed as a copywriter by the Gray Matter advertising agency. The little room in which he found himself was plainly the bookseller's sanctum and contained his own private library. Gilbert browsed along the shelves curiously. The volumes were mostly shabby and bruised. They had evidently been picked up one by one in the humble mangers of the second-hand vendor. They all showed marks of use and meditation. Mr. Gilbert had the earnest mania for self-improvement which has blighted the lives of so many young men, a passion which, however, is commendable in those who feel themselves handicapped by a college career and a jeweled fraternity emblem. It suddenly struck him that it would be valuable to make a list of some of the titles in Mifflin's collection as a suggestion for his own reading. He took out a memorandum book and began jotting down the books that intrigued him. The works of Francis Thompson, 3 volumes. Social History of Smoking, Apperson. The Path to Rome, Hilaire Belloc. The Book of T. Cacuzo. Happy Thoughts, F. C. Bernan. Dr. Johnson's Prayers and Meditations. Margaret Ogilvy, J. M. Barrie. Confessions of a Thug, Taylor. General Catalogue of the Oxford University Press. The Morning's War, C. E. Montague. The Spirit of Man, edited by Robert Bridges. The Romany Rye, Borrow. Poems, Emily Dickinson. Poems, George Herbert. The House of Cobwebs, George Gissing. So far had he got, and was beginning to say to himself that in the interests of advertising, who is a jealous mistress, he had best call a halt, when his host entered the room, his small face eager, his eyes blue points of light. "Come, Mr. Aubrey Gilbert," he cried. "The meal is set. You want to wash your hands? Make haste then, this way. The eggs are hot and waiting." The dining room into which the guest was conducted betrayed a feminine touch not visible in the smoke-dimmed quarters of shop and cabinet. At the windows were curtains of laughing chintz and pots of pink geranium. The table, under a droplight in a flame-colored silk screen, was brightly set with silver and blue china. In a cut-glass decanter sparkled a ruddy brown wine. The edged tool of advertising felt his spirits undergo an unmistakable upward pressure. "Sit down, sir," said Mifflin, lifting the roof of a platter. "These are eggs Samuel Butler, an invention of my own, the apotheosis of hen fruit." Gilbert greeted the invention with applause. An egg Samuel Butler, for the Notebook of Housewives, may be summarized as a pyramid based upon toast, whereof the chief masonries are a flake of bacon, an egg poached to firmness, a wreath of mushrooms, a capsheaf of red peppers, the whole dribbled with a warm pink sauce of which the inventor retains the secret. To this the bookseller chef added fried potatoes from another dish, and poured for his guest a glass of wine. "This is California Catawba," said Mifflin, "in which the grape and the sunshine very pleasantly and cheaply fulfill their allotted destiny. I pledge you prosperity to the black art of advertising. The psychology of the art and mystery of advertising rests upon tact, an instinctive perception of the tone and accent which will be in rapport with the mood of the hearer." Mr. Gilbert was aware of this, and felt that quite possibly his host was prouder of his whimsical avocation as gourmet than of his sacred profession as a bookman. "Is it possible, sir," he began, in lucid Johnsonian, "that you can concoct so delicious an entree in so few minutes? You are not hoaxing me? There is no secret passage between Gissing Street and the laboratories of the Ritz?" "Ah, you should taste Mrs. Mifflin's cooking," said the bookseller. "I am only an amateur who dabbles in the craft during her absence. She is on a visit to her cousin in Boston. She becomes, quite justifiably, weary of the tobacco of this establishment, and once or twice a year it does her good to breathe the pure serene of Beacon Hill. During her absence, it is my privilege to inquire into the ritual of housekeeping. I find it very sedative after the incessant excitement and speculation of the shop." "I should have thought," said Gilbert, "that life in a bookshop would be delightfully tranquil." "Far from it. Living in a bookshop is like living in a warehouse of explosives. Those shelves are ranked with the most furious combustibles in the world, the brains of men. I can spend a rainy afternoon reading, and my mind works itself up to such a passion and anxiety over mortal problems as almost unmans me. It is terribly nerve-wracking. Surround a man with Carlyle, Emerson, Thoreau, Chesterton, Shaw, Nietzsche, and George Ade. Would you wonder at his getting excited? What would happen to a cat if she had to live in a room tapestried with catnip? She would go crazy." "Truly, I had never thought of that phase of bookselling," said the young man. "How is it, though, that libraries are shrines of such austere calm? If books are as provocative as you suggest, one would expect every librarian to utter the shrill screams of a hierophant, to clash ecstatic castanets in his silent alcoves. Ah, my boy, you forget the card index. Librarians invented that soothing device for the febrifuge of their souls, just as I fall back upon the rights of the kitchen. Librarians would all go mad, those capable of concentrated thought, if they did not have the cool and healing card index as medicament. Some more of the eggs?" "Thank you," said Gilbert. "Who was the butler whose name was associated with the dish?" "What?" cried Mifflin in agitation. "You have not heard of Samuel Butler, the author of The Way of All Flesh? My dear young man, whoever permits himself to die before he has read that book, and also Erewhon, has deliberately forfeited his chances of paradise. For paradise in the world to come is uncertain, but there is indeed a heaven on this earth, a heaven which we inhabit when we read a good book. Pour yourself another glass of wine, and permit me." Here followed an enthusiastic development of the perverse philosophy of Samuel Butler, which, in deference to my readers, I omit. Mr. Gilbert took notes of the conversation in his pocketbook, and I am pleased to say that his heart was moved to a realization of his iniquity, for he was observed at the public library a few days later asking for a copy of The Way of All Flesh. After inquiring at 4 libraries, and finding all copies of the book in circulation, he was compelled to buy one. He never regretted doing so. "But I am forgetting my duties as host," said Mifflin. "Our dessert consists of applesauce, gingerbread, and coffee." He rapidly cleared the empty dishes from the table and brought on the second course. "I have been noticing the warning over the sideboard," said Gilbert. "I hope you will let me help you this evening." He pointed to a card hanging near the kitchen door. It read, "Always wash dishes. Immediately after meals. It saves trouble." "I'm afraid I don't always obey that precept," said the bookseller as he poured the coffee. "Mrs. Mifflin hangs it there whenever she goes away, to remind me. But, as our friend Samuel Butler says, he that is stupid in little will also be stupid in much. I have a different theory about dishwashing, and I please myself by indulging it. I used to regard dishwashing merely as an ignoble chore, a kind of hateful discipline which had to be undergone with knitted brow and brazen fortitude. When my wife went away the first time, I erected a reading stand and an electric light over the sink, and used to read while my hands went automatically through base gestures of purification. I made the great spirits of literature partners of my sorrow, and learned by heart a good deal of Paradise Lost and of Walt Mason, while I soused and wallowed among pots and pans. I used to comfort myself with 2 lines of Keats. The moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores. Then a new conception of the matter struck me. It is intolerable for a human being to go on doing any task as a penance, under duress. No matter what the work is, one must spiritualize it in some way, shatter the old idea of it into bits and rebuild it nearer to the heart's desire. How was I to do this with dishwashing? I broke a good many plates while I was pondering over the matter. Then it occurred to me that here was just the relaxation I needed. I had been worrying over the mental strain of being surrounded all day long by vociferous books, crying out at me their conflicting views as to the glories and agonies of life. Why not make dishwashing my balm and poultice? When one views a stubborn fact from a new angle, it is amazing how all its contours and edges change shape. Immediately my dishpan began to glow with a kind of philosophic halo. The warm, soapy water became a sovereign medicine to retract hot blood from the head. The homely act of washing and drying cups and saucers became a symbol of the order and cleanliness that man imposes on the unruly world about him. I tore down my book rack and reading lamp from over the sink. Mr. Gilbert, he went on, do not laugh at me when I tell you that I have evolved a whole kitchen philosophy of my own. I find the kitchen the shrine of our civilization, the focus of all that is comely in life. The ruddy shine of the stove is as beautiful as any sunset. A well-polished jug or spoon is as fair, as complete and beautiful as any sonnet. The dish mop, properly rinsed and wrung and hung outside the back door to dry, is a whole sermon in itself. The stars never look so bright as they do from the kitchen door after the icebox pan is emptied, and the whole place is redd up, as the Scotch say. A very delightful philosophy indeed, said Gilbert. And now that we have finished our meal, I insist upon your letting me give you a hand with the washing up. I am eager to test this dish pantheism of yours. My dear fellow, said Mifflin, laying a restraining hand on his impetuous guest, it is a poor philosophy that will not abide denial now and then. No, no, I did not ask you to spend the evening with me to wash dishes. And he led the way back to his sitting room. When I saw you come in, said Mifflin, I was afraid you might be a newspaper man, looking for an interview. A young journalist came to see us once, with very unhappy results. He wheedled himself into Mrs. Mifflin's good graces, and ended by putting us both into a book, called Parnassus on Wheels, which has been rather a trial to me. In that book he attributes to me a number of shallow and sugary observations upon bookselling that have been an annoyance to the trade. I am happy to say, though, that his book had only a trifling sale. I have never heard of it, said Gilbert. If you are really interested in bookselling, you should come here some evening to a meeting of the Corn Cob Club. Once a month a number of booksellers gather here, and we discuss matters of bookish concern over corn cobs and cider. We have all sorts and conditions of booksellers. One is a fanatic on the subject of libraries. He thinks that every public library should be dynamited. Another thinks that moving pictures will destroy the book trade. What rot! Surely everything that arouses people's minds, that makes them alert and questioning, increases their appetite for books. The life of a bookseller is very demoralizing to the intellect, he went on after a pause. He is surrounded by innumerable books. He cannot possibly read them all. He dips into one and picks up a scrap from another. His mind gradually fills itself with miscellaneous flotsam, with superficial opinions, with 1,000 half-knowledges. Almost unconsciously he begins to rate literature according to what people ask for. He begins to wonder whether Ralph Waldo Trine isn't really greater than Ralph Waldo Emerson, whether J.M. Chappell isn't as big a man as J.M. Barrie. That way lies intellectual suicide. One thing, however, you must grant the good bookseller. He is tolerant. He is patient of all ideas and theories. Surrounded, engulfed by the torrent of men's words, he is willing to listen to them all. Even to the publisher's salesman, he turns an indulgent ear. He is willing to be humbugged for the weal of humanity. He hopes unceasingly for good books to be born. My business, you see, is different from most. I only deal in second-hand books. I only buy books that I consider have some honest reason for existence. And so far as human judgment can discern, I try to keep trash out of my shelves. A doctor doesn't traffic in quack remedies. I don't traffic in bogus books. A comical thing happened the other day. There is a certain wealthy man, a Mr. Chapman, who has long frequented this shop. I wonder if that could be Mr. Chapman of the Chapman Daintybits Company, said Gilbert, feeling his feet touch familiar soil. The same, I believe, said Mifflin. Do you know him? Ah, cried the young man with reverence. There is a man who can tell you the virtues of advertising. If he is interested in books, it is advertising that made it possible. We handle all his copy. I've written a lot of it myself. We have made the Chapman prunes a staple of civilization and culture. I myself devised that slogan, "We preen ourselves on our prunes," which you see in every big magazine. Chapman prunes are known the world over. The Mikado eats them once a week. The Pope eats them. Why, we have just heard that 13 cases of them are to be put on board the George Washington for the President's voyage to the peace conference. The Czechoslovak armies were fed largely on prunes. It is our conviction in the office that our campaign for the Chapman prunes did much to win the war. I read in an ad the other day, perhaps you wrote that too, said the bookseller, that the Elgin watch had won the war. However, Mr. Chapman has long been one of my best customers. He heard about the Corn Cob Club, and though of course he is not a bookseller, he begged to come to our meetings. We were glad to have him do so, and he has entered into our discussions with great zeal. Often he has offered many a shrewd comment. He has grown so enthusiastic about the bookseller's way of life that the other day he wrote to me about his daughter. He is a widower. She has been attending a fashionable girls' school where, he says, they have filled her head with absurd, wasteful, snobbish notions. He says she has no more idea of the usefulness and beauty of life than a Pomeranian dog. Instead of sending her to college, he has asked me if Mrs. Mifflin and I will take her in here to learn to sell books. He wants her to think she is earning her keep and is going to pay me privately for the privilege of having her live here. He thinks that being surrounded by books will put some sense in her head. I am rather nervous about the experiment, but it is a compliment to the shop, isn't it? Ye gods, cried Gilbert. What advertising copy that would make! At this point the bell in the shop rang, and Mifflin jumped up. This part of the evening is often rather busy, he said. I'm afraid I'll have to go down on the floor. Some of my habitués rather expect me to be on hand to gossip about books. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed myself, said Gilbert. I'm going to come again and study your shelves. Well, keep it dark about the young lady, said the bookseller. I don't want all you young blades dropping in here to unsettle her mind. If she falls in love with anybody in this shop, it'll have to be Joseph Conrad or John Keats. As he passed out, Gilbert saw Roger Mifflin engaged in argument with a bearded man who looked like a college professor. Carlyle's Oliver Cromwell, he was saying. Yes, indeed. Right over here. Hello, that's odd. It was here. Chapter 2. The Corn Cob Club. The latter half of this chapter may be omitted by all readers who are not booksellers. The Haunted Bookshop was a delightful place, especially of an evening, when its drowsy alcoves were kindled with the brightness of lamps shining on the rows of volumes. Many a passerby would stumble down the steps from the street in sheer curiosity. Others, familiar visitors, dropped in with the same comfortable emotion that a man feels on entering his club. Roger's custom was to sit at his desk in the rear, puffing his pipe and reading. Though if any customer started a conversation, the little man was quick and eager to carry it on. The lion of talk lay only sleeping in him. It was not hard to goad it up. It may be remarked that all bookshops that are open in the evening are busy in the after-supper hours. Is it that the true book lovers are nocturnal gentry, only venturing forth when darkness and silence and the gleam of hooded lights irresistibly suggest reading? Certainly nighttime has a mystic affinity for literature, and it is strange that the Eskimo have created no great books. Surely, for most of us, an Arctic night would be insupportable without O. Henry and Stevenson. Or, as Roger Mifflin remarked during a passing enthusiasm for Ambrose Bierce, the The true Nox Ambrosiani are the Nox Ambrose-Bierciani. But Roger was prompt in closing Parnassus at 10 o'clock. At that hour he and Bach, the mustard-colored terrier, named for Boccaccio, would make the round of the shop, see that everything was shipshape, empty the ashtrays provided for customers, lock the front door, and turn off the lights. Then they would retire to the den, where Mrs. Mifflin was generally knitting or reading. She would brew a pot of cocoa, and they would read or talk for half an hour or so before bed. Sometimes Roger would take a stroll along Gissing Street before turning in. All day spent with books has a rather exhausting effect on the mind, and he used to enjoy the fresh air sweeping up the dark Brooklyn streets, meditating some thought that had sprung from his reading, while Bach sniffed and padded along in the manner of an elderly dog at night. While Mrs. Mifflin was away, however, Roger's routine was somewhat different. After closing the shop, he would return to his desk and with a furtive, shame-faced air take out from a bottom drawer an untidy folder of notes and manuscript. This was the skeleton in his closet, his secret sin. It was the scaffolding of his book, which he had been compiling for at least 10 years, and to which he had tentatively assigned such different titles as Notes on Literature, The Muse on Crutches, Books and I, and What a Young Bookseller Ought to Know. It had begun long ago, in the days of his odyssey as a rural book huckster, under the title of Literature Among the Farmers, but it had branched out until it began to appear that, in bulk at least, Ridpath would have to look to his linoleum laurels. The manuscript in its present state had neither beginning nor end, but it was growing strenuously in the middle, and hundreds of pages were covered with Roger's minute script. The chapter on Ars Bibliopoly, or the art of bookselling, would be, he hoped, a classic among generations of book vendors still unborn. Seated at his disorderly desk, caressed by a counterpane of drifting tobacco haze, he would pore over the manuscript, crossing out, interpolating, re-arguing, and then referring to volumes on his shelves. Bach would snore under the chair, and soon Roger's brain would begin to waver. In the end, he would fall asleep over his papers, wake with a cramp about 2 o'clock, and creak irritably to a lonely bed. All this we mention only to explain how it was that Roger was dozing at his desk about midnight, the evening after the call paid by Aubrey Gilbert. He was awakened by a draft of chill air passing like a mountain brook over his bald pate. Stiffly he sat up and looked about. The shop was in darkness save for the bright electric over his head. Bach, of more regular habit than his master, had gone back to his couch in the kitchen, made of a packing case that had once coffined a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. "That's funny," said Roger to himself. "Surely I locked the door?" He walked to the front of the shop, switching on the cluster of lights that hung from the ceiling. The door was ajar, but everything else seemed as usual. Bach, hearing his footsteps, came trotting out from the kitchen, his claws rattling on the bare wooden floor. He looked up with the patient inquiry of a dog accustomed to the eccentricities of his patron. "I guess I'm getting absent-minded," said Roger. "I must have left the door open." He closed and locked it. Then he noticed that the terrier was sniffing in the history alcove, which was at the front of the shop on the left-hand side. "What is it, old man?" said Roger. "Want something to read in bed?" He turned on the light in that alcove. Everything appeared normal. Then he noticed a book that projected an inch or so beyond the even line of bindings. It was a fad of Roger's to keep all his books in a flat row on the shelves, and almost every evening at closing time he used to run his palm along the backs of the volumes to level any irregularities left by careless browsers. He put out a hand to push the book into place. Then he stopped. "Queer again," he thought. "Carlyle's Oliver Cromwell. I looked for that book last night and couldn't find it. When that professor fellow was here. Maybe I'm tired and can't see straight. I'll go to bed." The next day was a date of some moment. Not only was it Thanksgiving Day, with the November meeting of the Corn Cob Club scheduled for that evening, but Mrs. Mifflin had promised to get home from Boston in time to bake a chocolate cake for the booksellers. It was said that some of the members of the club were faithful in attendance more by reason of Mrs. Mifflin's chocolate cake, and the cask of cider that her brother Andrew McGill sent down from the Sabine farm every autumn, than on account of the bookish conversation. Roger spent the morning in doing a little house cleaning, in preparation for his wife's return. He was a trifle abashed to find how many mingled crumbs and tobacco cinders had accumulated on the dining room rug. He cooked himself a modest lunch of lamb chops and baked potatoes, and was pleased by an epigram concerning food that came into his mind. "It's not the food you dream about that matters," he said to himself. "It's the victuals that walk right in and become a member of the family." He felt that this needed a little polishing and rephrasing, but that there was a germ of wit in it. He had a habit of encountering ideas at his solitary meals. After this, he was busy at the sink scrubbing the dishes, when he was surprised by feeling two very competent arms surround him, and a pink gingham apron was thrown over his head. "Mifflin," said his wife, "how many times have I told you to put on an apron when you wash up?" They greeted each other with the hearty, affectionate simplicity of those congenially wedded in middle age. Helen Mifflin was a buxom, healthy creature, rich in good sense and good humor, well nourished both in mind and body. She kissed Roger's bald head, tied the apron around his shrimpish person, and sat down on a kitchen chair to watch him finish wiping the china. Her cheeks were cool and ruddy from the keen air, her face lit with the tranquil satisfaction of those who have sojourned in the comfortable city of Boston. "Well, my dear," said Roger, "this makes it a real Thanksgiving. You look as plump and full of matter as the home book of verse." "I've had a stunning time," she said, patting Bach, who stood at her knee, imbibing the familiar and mysterious fragrance by which dogs identify their human friends. "I haven't even heard of a book for 3 weeks. I did stop in at the old Angle Bookshop yesterday, just to say hello to Joe Jillings. He says all booksellers are crazy, but that you are the craziest of the lot. He wants to know if you're bankrupt yet." Roger's slate blue eyes twinkled. He hung up a cup in the china closet and lit his pipe before replying. "What did you say?" "I said that our shop was haunted and mustn't be supposed to come under the usual conditions of the trade." "Bully for you. And what did Joe say to that?" "Haunted by the nuts." "Well," said Roger, "when literature goes bankrupt, I'm willing to go with it. Not till then. But by the way, we're going to be haunted by a beauteous damsel pretty soon. You remember my telling you that Mr. Chapman wants to send his daughter to work in the shop? Well, here's a letter I had from him this morning." He rummaged in his pocket and produced the following, which Mrs. Mifflin read. "Dear Mr. Mifflin, I am so delighted that you and Mrs. Mifflin are willing to try the experiment of taking my daughter as an apprentice. Titania is really a very charming girl, and if only we can get some of the finishing school nonsense out of her head, she will make a fine woman. She has had, it was my fault, not hers, the disadvantage of being brought up, or rather brought down, by having every possible want and whim gratified. Out of kindness for herself and her future husband, if she should have one, I want her to learn a little about earning a living. She is nearly 19, and I told her if she would try the bookshop job for a while, I would take her to Europe for a year afterward. As I explained to you, I want her to think she is really earning her way. Of course, I don't want the routine to be too hard for her, but I do want her to get some idea of what it means to face life on one's own. If you will pay her $10 a week as a beginner and deduct her board from that, I will pay you $20 a week, privately, for your responsibility in caring for her and keeping your and Mrs. Mifflin's friendly eyes on her. I'm coming round to the corn cob meeting tomorrow night, and we can make the final arrangements. Luckily, she is very fond of books, and I really think she is looking forward to the adventure with much anticipation. I overheard her saying to one of her friends yesterday that she was going to do some literary work this winter. That's the kind of nonsense I want her to outgrow. When I hear her say that she's got a job in a bookstore, I'll know she's cured. Cordially yours, George Chapman." "Well," said Roger, as Mrs. Mifflin made no comment, "don't you think it will be rather interesting to get a naive young girl's reactions toward the problems of our tranquil existence?" "Roger, you blessed innocent," cried his wife. "Life will no longer be tranquil with a girl of 19 round the place. You may fool yourself, but you can't fool me. A girl of 19 doesn't react toward things. She explodes. Things don't react anywhere but in Boston and in chemical laboratories. I suppose you know you're taking a human bombshell into the arsenal?" Roger looked dubious. "I remember something in Weir of Hermiston about a girl being an explosive engine," he said. but I don't see that she can do any very great harm round here. We're both pretty well proof against shell shock. The worst that could happen would be if she got hold of my private copy of Fireside Conversation in the Age of Queen Elizabeth. Remind me to lock it up somewhere, will you? This secret masterpiece by Mark Twain was one of the bookseller's treasures. Not even Helen had ever been permitted to read it, and she had shrewdly judged that it was not in her line, for though she knew perfectly well where he kept it, together with his life insurance policy, some Liberty bonds, an autograph letter from Charles Spencer Chapman, and a snapshot of herself taken on their honeymoon, she had never made any attempt to examine it. "Well," said Helen, "Titania or no Titania, if the corn cobs want their chocolate cake tonight, I must get busy. Take my suitcase upstairs like a good fellow." A gathering of booksellers is a pleasant sanhedrim to attend. The members of this ancient craft bear mannerisms and earmarks just as definitely recognizable as those of the cloak and suit business or any other trade. They are likely to be a little, shall we say, worn at the bindings, as becomes men who have forsaken worldly profit to pursue a noble calling ill-rewarded in cash. They are possibly a trifle embittered, which is an excellent demeanor for mankind in the face of inscrutable heaven. Long experience with publishers' salesmen makes them suspicious of books praised between the courses of a heavy meal. When a publisher's salesman takes you out to dinner, it is not surprising if the conversation turns toward literature about the time the last of the peas are being harried about the plate. But, as Jerry Gladfist says, he runs a shop up on 38th Street, the publisher's salesmen supply a long-felt want, for they do now and then buy one a dinner the like of which no bookseller would otherwise be likely to commit. "Well, gentlemen," said Roger as his guests assembled in his little cabinet, "it's a cold evening. Pull up toward the fire. Make free with the cider. The cake's on the table. My wife came back from Boston specially to make it." "Here's Mrs. Mifflin's health," said Mr. Chapman, a quiet little man who had a habit of listening to what he heard. "I hope she doesn't mind keeping the shop while we celebrate?" "Not a bit," said Roger. "She enjoys it." "I see Tarzan of the Apes is running at the Gissing Street Movie Palace," said Gladfist. "Great stuff. Have you seen it?" "Not while I can still read The Jungle Book," said Roger. "You make me tired with that talk about literature," cried Jerry. "A book's a book, even if Harold Bellwright wrote it." "A book's a book if you enjoy reading it," amended Meredith, from a big Fifth Avenue bookstore. "Lots of people enjoy Harold Bellwright, just as lots of people enjoy tripe. Either of them would kill me, but let's be tolerant." "Your argument is a whole succession of non sequiturs," said Jerry, stimulated by the cider to unusual brilliance. "That's a long putt," chuckled Benson, the dealer in rare books and first editions. "What I mean is this," said Jerry. "We aren't literary critics. It's none of our business to say what's good and what isn't. Our job is simply to supply the public with the books it wants when it wants them. How it comes to want the books it does is no concern of ours." "You're the guy that calls bookselling the worst business in the world," said Roger warmly, "and you're the kind of guy that makes it so. I suppose you would say that it is no concern of the bookseller to try to increase the public appetite for books." "Appetite is too strong a word," said Jerry. "As far as books are concerned, the public is barely able to sit up and take a little liquid nourishment. Solid foods don't interest it. If you try to cram roast beef down the gullet of an invalid, you'll kill him. Let the public alone, and thank God when it comes round to amputate any of its hard-earned cash." "Well, take it on the lowest basis," said Roger. "I haven't any facts to go upon." "You never have," interjected Jerry. "But I'd like to bet that the trade has made more money out of Bryce's American Commonwealth than it ever did out of all Parson Wright's books put together." "What of it? Why shouldn't they make both?" This preliminary tilt was interrupted by the arrival of two more visitors, and Roger handed round mugs of cider, pointed to the cake and the basket of pretzels, and lit his corncob pipe. The new arrivals were Quincy and Fruehling, the former a clerk in the book department of a vast dry goods store, the latter the owner of a bookshop in the Hebrew quarter of Grand Street, one of the best-stocked shops in the city, though little known to uptown book lovers. "Well," said Fruehling, his bright dark eyes sparkling above richly tinted cheekbones and bushy beard, "what's the argument?" "The usual one," said Gladfist, grinning. Mifflin confusing merchandise with metaphysics. Mifflin, not at all. I am simply saying that it is good business to sell only the best. Gladfist, wrong again. You must select your stock according to your customers. Ask Quincy here. Would there be any sense in his loading up his shelves with Maeterlinck and Shaw when the department store trade wants Eleanor Porter and the Tarzan stuff? Does a country grocer carry the same cigars that are listed on the wine card of a Fifth Avenue hotel? Of course not. He gets in the cigars that his trade enjoys and is accustomed to. Bookselling must obey the ordinary rules of commerce. Mifflin, a fig for the ordinary rules of commerce. I came over here to Gissing Street to get away from them. My mind would blow out its fuses if I had to abide by the dirty little considerations of supply and demand. As far as I am concerned, supply creates demand. Gladfist, still, old chap, you have to abide by the dirty little consideration of earning a living, unless someone has endowed you. Benson, of course my line of business isn't strictly the same as you fellows, but a thought that has often occurred to me in selling rare editions may interest you. The customer's willingness to part with his money is usually in inverse ratio to the permanent benefit he expects to derive from what he purchases. Meredith, sounds a bit like John Stuart Mill. Benson, even so, it may be true. Folks will pay a darn sight more to be amused than they will to be exalted. Look at the way a man shells out 5 bones for a couple of theater seats, or spends a couple of dollars a week on cigars without thinking of it. Yet $2 or $5 for a book costs him positive anguish. The mistake you fellows in the retail trade have made is in trying to persuade your customers that books are necessities. Tell them they're luxuries. That'll get them. People have to work so hard in this life they're shy of necessities. A man will go on wearing a suit until it's threadbare, much sooner than smoke a threadbare cigar. Gladfist, not a bad thought. You know, Mifflin here calls me a material-minded cynic, but by thunder, I think I'm more idealistic than he is. I'm no propagandist incessantly trying to cajole poor innocent customers into buying the kind of book under think they ought to buy. When I see the helpless pathos of most of them, who drift into a bookstore without the slightest idea of what they want or what is worth reading, I would disdain to take advantage of their frailty. They are absolutely at the mercy of the salesman. They will buy whatever he tells them to. Now the honorable man, the high-minded man, by which I mean myself, is too proud to ram some shimmering stuff at them just because he thinks they ought to read it. Let the boobs blunder around and grab what they can. Let natural selection operate. I think it is fascinating to watch them, to see their helpless groping, and to study the weird ways in which they make their choice. Usually they will buy a book either because they think the jacket is attractive, or because it costs $1.25 instead of $1.50, or because they say they saw a review of it. The review usually turns out to be an ad. I don't think one book buyer in 1,000 knows the difference. Mifflin, your doctrine is pitiless, base, and false. What would you think of a physician who saw men suffering from a curable disease and did nothing to alleviate their sufferings? Gladfist, their sufferings, as you call them, are nothing to what mine would be if I stocked up with a lot of books that no one but highbrows would buy. What would you think of a base public that would go past my shop day after day and let the high-minded occupant die of starvation? Mifflin, your ailment, Jerry, is that you conceive yourself as merely a tradesman. What I'm telling you is that the bookseller is a public servant. He ought to be pensioned by the state. The honor of his profession should compel him to do all he can to spread the distribution of good stuff. Quincy, I think you forget how much we who deal chiefly in new books are at the mercy of the publishers. We have to stock the new stuff, a large proportion of which is always punk. Why it is punk, goodness knows, because most of the bum books don't sell. Mifflin, that is a mystery indeed, but I can give you a fair reason. First, because there isn't enough good stuff to go round. Second, because of the ignorance of the publishers, many of whom honestly don't know a good book when they see it. It is a matter of sheer heedlessness in the selection of what they intend to publish. A big drug factory or a manufacturer of a well-known jam spends vast sums of money on chemically assaying and analyzing the ingredients that are to go into his medicines or in gathering and selecting the fruit that is to be stewed into jam. And yet they tell me that the most important department of a publishing business, which is the gathering and sampling of manuscripts, is the least considered and the least remunerated. I knew a reader for one publishing house. He was a babe recently out of college who didn't know a book from a frat pin. If a jam factory employs a trained chemist, why isn't it worth a publisher's while to employ an expert book analyzer? There are some of them. Look at the fellow who runs the Pacific Monthly's book business, for example. He knows a thing or two. Chapman, I think perhaps you exaggerate the value of those trained experts. They are likely to be four-flushers. We had one once at our factory, and as far as I could make out, he never thought we were doing good business except when we were losing money. Mifflin, as far as I have been able to observe, making money is the easiest thing in the world. All you have to do is to turn out an honest product, something that the public needs. Then you have to let them know that you have it and teach them that they need it. They will batter down your front door in their eagerness to get it. But if you begin to hand them gold bricks, if you begin to sell them books built like an apartment house, all marble front and all brick behind, you're cutting your own throat, or rather cutting your own pocket, which is the same thing. Meredith, I think Mifflin's right. You know the kind of place our shop is, a regular Fifth Avenue store, all plate glass front and marble columns glowing in the indirect lighting like a birchwood at full moon. We sell hundreds of dollars worth of bunkum every day because people ask for it. But I tell you, we do it with reluctance. It's rather the custom in our shop to scoff at the book-buying public and call them boobs, but they really want good books. The poor souls don't know how to get them. Still, Jerry has a certain grain of truth to his credit. I get 10 times more satisfaction in selling a copy of Newton's The Amenities of Book Collecting than I do in selling a copy of, well, Tarzan. But it's poor business to impose your own private tastes on your customers. All you can do is to hint them along tactfully, when you get a chance, toward the stuff that counts. Quincy, you remind me of something that happened in our book department the other day. A flapper came in and said she had forgotten the name of the book she wanted, but it was something about a young man who had been brought up by the monks. I was stumped. I tried her with the cloister and the hearth and monastery bells and legends of the monastic orders and so on, but her face was blank. Then one of the salesgirls overheard us talking, and she guessed it right off the bat. Of course it was Tarzan. Mifflin, you poor simp, there was your chance to introduce her to Mowgli and the Bondarlock. Quincy, true. I didn't think of it. Mifflin, I'd like to get you fellows ideas about advertising. There was a young chap in here the other day from an advertising agency trying to get me to put some copy in the papers. Have you found that it pays? Fooling. It always pays, somebody. The only question is, does it pay the man who pays for the ad? Meredith, what do you mean? Fooling. Did you ever consider the problem of what I call tangential advertising? By that I mean advertising that benefits your rival rather than yourself. Take an example. On 6th Avenue there is a lovely delicatessen shop, but rather expensive. Every conceivable kind of sweetmeat and relish is displayed in the brightly lit window. When you look at that window, it simply makes your mouth water. You decide to have something to eat. But do you get it there? Not much. You go a little farther down the street and get it at the Automat or the Crystal Lunch. The delicatessen fellow pays the overhead expense of that beautiful food exhibit, and the other man gets the benefit of it. It's the same way in my business. I'm in a factory district where people can't afford to have any but the best books. Meredith will bear me out in saying that only the wealthy can afford the poor ones. They read the book ads in the papers and magazines, the ads of Meredith's shop and others, and then they come to me to buy them. I believe in advertising, but I believe in letting someone else pay for it. Mifflin, I guess perhaps I can afford to go on riding on Meredith's ads. I hadn't thought of that, but I think I shall put a little notice in one of the papers someday, just a little card saying, Parnassus at home, good books bought and sold. This shop is haunted. It will be fun to see what comeback I get. Quincy, the book section of a department store doesn't get much chance to enjoy that tangential advertising, as Fruehling calls it. Why, when our interior decorating shark puts a few volumes of a pirated Kipling bound in crushed oilcloth or a copy of Knock-Kneed Stories into the window to show off a Louis XVIII boudoir suite, display space is charged up against my department. Last summer he asked me for something by that Ring fellow, I forget the name, to put a punchy finish on a layout of porch furniture. I thought perhaps he meant Wagner's Nibelungen operas, and began to dig them out. Then I found he meant Ring Lardner. Gladfist, there you are. I keep telling you bookselling is an impossible job for a man who loves literature. When did a bookseller ever make any real contribution to the world's happiness? Mifflin, Dr. Johnson's father, was a bookseller. Gladfist, yes, and couldn't afford to pay for Sam's education. Fruling, there's another kind of tangential advertising that interests me. Take, for instance, a Coles Phillips painting for some brand of silk stockings. Of course, the highlights of the picture are cunningly focused on the stockings of the eminently beautiful lady, but there is always something else in the picture, an automobile or a country house or a Morris chair or a parasol, which makes it just as effective an ad for those goods as it is for the stockings. Every now and then Phillips sticks a book into his paintings, and I expect the Fifth Avenue book trade benefits by it. A book that fits the mind as well as a silk stocking does the ankle will be sure to sell. Mifflin, you are all crass materialists. I tell you, books are the depositories of the human spirit, which is the only thing in this world that endures. What was it Shakespeare said? Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. By the bones of the Hohenzollerns, he was right. And wait a minute, there's something in Carlyle's Cromwell that comes back to me. He ran excitedly out of the room, and the members of the Corn Cob fraternity grinned at each other. Gladfist cleaned his pipe and poured out some more cider. He's off on his hobby, he chuckled. I love baiting him. Speaking of Carlyle's Cromwell, said Fruling, that's a book I don't often hear asked for. But a fellow came in the other day hunting for a copy, and to my chagrin I didn't have one. I rather pride myself on keeping that sort of thing in stock. So I called up Brentanos to see if I could pick one up, and they told me they had just sold the only copy they had. Somebody must have been boosting Thomas. Maybe he's quoted in Tarzan, or somebody has bought up the film rights. Mifflin came in, looking rather annoyed. Here's an odd thing, he said. I know damn well that copy of Cromwell was on the shelf because I saw it there last night. It's not there now. That's nothing, said Quincy. You know how people come into a second-hand store, see a book they take a fancy to but don't feel like buying just then, and tuck it away out of sight or on some other shelf where they think no one else will spot it, but they'll be able to find it when they can afford it. Probably someone's done that with your Cromwell. Maybe, but I doubt it, said Mifflin. Mrs. Mifflin says she didn't sell it this evening. I woke her up to ask her. She was dozing over her knitting at the desk. I guess she's tired after her trip. I'm sorry to miss the Carlyle quotation, said Benson. What was the gist? I think I've got it jotted down in a notebook, said Roger, hunting along a shelf. Yes, here it is. He read aloud. The works of a man, bury them under what guano mountains and obscene owl droppings you will, do not perish, cannot perish. What of heroism, what of eternal light was in a man and his life, is with very great exactness added to the eternities, remains forever a new divine portion of the sum of things. Now, my friends, the bookseller is one of the keys in that universal adding machine, because he aids in the cross-fertilization of men and books. His delight in his calling doesn't need to be stimulated even by the bright shanks of a Coles Phillips picture. Roger, my boy, said Gladfist, your innocent enthusiasm makes me think of Tom Daly's favorite story about the Irish priest who was rebuking his flock for their love of whiskey. Whiskey, he said, is the bane of this congregation. Whiskey that steals away a man's brains. Whiskey that makes you shoot at landlords and not hit them. Even so, my dear Roger, your enthusiasm makes you shoot at truth and never come anywhere near it. Jerry, said Roger, you are a upas tree. Your shadow is poisonous. Well, gentlemen, said Mr. Chapman, I know Mrs. Mifflin wants to be relieved of her post. I vote we adjourn early. Your conversation is always delightful, though I am sometimes a bit uncertain as to the conclusions. My daughter is going to be a bookseller, and I shall look forward to hearing her views on the business. As the guests made their way out through the shop, Mr. Chapman drew Roger aside. It's perfectly all right about sending Titania, he asked. Absolutely, said Roger. When does she want to come? Is tomorrow too soon? The sooner the better. We've got a little spare room upstairs that she can have. I've got some ideas of my own about furnishing it for her. Send her round tomorrow afternoon. Chapter 3. Titania arrives. The first pipe after breakfast is a rite of some importance to seasoned smokers, and Roger applied the flame to the bowl as he stood at the bottom of the stairs. He blew a great gush of strong blue reek that eddied behind him as he ran up the flight, his mind eagerly meditating the congenial task of arranging the little spare room for the coming employee. Then, at the top of the steps, he found that his pipe had already gone out. What with filling my pipe and emptying it, lighting it and relighting it, he thought, I don't seem to get much time for the serious concerns of life. Come to think of it, smoking, soiling dishes and washing them, talking and listening to other people talk, take up most of life anyway. This theory rather pleased him, so he ran downstairs again to tell it to Mrs. Mifflin. Go along and get that room fixed up, she said, and don't try to palm off any bogus doctrines on me so early in the morning. Housewives have no time for philosophy after breakfast. Roger thoroughly enjoyed himself in the task of preparing the guest room for the new assistant. It was a small chamber at the back of the second story, opening on to a narrow passage that connected through a door with the gallery of the bookshop. Two small windows commanded a view of the modest roofs of that quarter of Brooklyn, roofs that conceal so many brave hearts, so many baby carriages, so many cups of bad coffee, and so many cartons of the Chapman prunes. By the way, he called downstairs, better have some of the prunes for supper tonight, just as a compliment to Miss Chapman. Mrs. Mifflin preserved a humorous silence. Over these non-committal summits, the bright eye of the bookseller, as he tacked up the freshly ironed muslin curtains Mrs. Mifflin had allotted, could discern a glimpse of the bay and the Leviathan ferries that link Staten Island with civilization. Just a touch of romance in the outlook, he thought to himself. It will suffice to keep a blazy young girl aware of the excitements of existence. The room, as might be expected in a house presided over by Helen Mifflin, was in perfect order to receive any occupant, but Roger had volunteered to psychologize it in such a fashion as, he thought, would convey favorable influences to the misguided young spirit that was to be its tenant. Incurable idealist, he had taken quite gravely his responsibility as landlord and employer of Mr. Chapman's daughter. No chambered nautilus was to have better opportunity to expand the tender mansions of its soul. Beside the bed was a bookshelf with a reading lamp. The problem Roger was discussing was what books and pictures might be the best preachers to this congregation of one. To Mrs. Mifflin's secret amusement, he had taken down the picture of Sir Galahad which he had once hung there, because, as he had said, if Sir Galahad were living today, he would be a bookseller. We don't want her feasting her imagination on young Galahads, he had remarked at breakfast. That way lies premature matrimony. What I want to do is put up in her room one or two good prints representing actual men who were so delightful in their day that all the young men she is likely to see now will seem tepid and prehensile. Thus she will become disgusted with the present generation of youths, and there will be some chance of her really putting her mind on the book business. Accordingly, he had spent some time in going through a bin where he kept photos and drawings of authors that the publishers' publicity men were always showering upon him. After some thought, he discarded promising engravings of Harold Bellwright and Stephen Leacock, and chose pictures of Shelley, Anthony Trollope, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Robert Burns. Then, after further meditation, he decided that neither Shelley nor Burns would quite do for a young girl's room, and set them aside in favor of a portrait of Samuel Butler. To these he added a framed text that he was very fond of and had hung over his own desk. He had once clipped it from a copy of Life and found much pleasure in it. It runs thus: On the return of a book lent to a friend, I give humble and hearty thanks for the safe return of this book, which, having endured the perils of my friend's bookcase and the bookcases of my friend's friends, now returns to me in reasonably good condition. I give humble and hearty thanks that my friend did not see fit to give this book to his infant as a plaything, nor use it as an ashtray for his burning cigar, nor as a teething ring for his mastiff. When I lent this book, I deemed it as lost. I was resigned to the bitterness of the long parting. I never thought to look upon its pages again. But now that my book is come back to me, I rejoice and am exceeding glad. Bring hither the fatted morocco, and let us rebind the volume and set it on the shelf of honor. For this my book was lent, and is returned again. Presently, therefore, I may return some of the books that I myself have borrowed. There, he thought, That will convey to her the first element of book morality. These decorations having been displayed on the walls, he bethought himself of the books that should stand on the bedside shelf. This is a question that admits of the utmost nicety of discussion. Some authorities hold that the proper books for a guest room are of a soporific quality that will induce swift and painless repose. This school advises The Wealth of Nations, Rome Under the Caesars, The Statesman's Yearbook, certain novels of Henry James, and the Letters of Queen Victoria, in 3 volumes. It is plausibly contended that books of this kind cannot be read, late at night, for more than a few minutes at a time, and that they afford useful scraps of information. Another branch of opinion recommends for bedtime reading short stories, volumes of pithy anecdote, swift and sparkling stuff that may keep one awake for a space, yet will advantage all the sweeter slumber in the end. Even ghost stories and harrowing matter are maintained seasonable by these pundits. This class of reading comprises O. Henry, Bret Harte, Leonard Merrick, Ambrose Bierce, W. W. Jacobs, Daudet, de Maupassant, and possibly even On a Slow Train Through Arkansas, that grievous classic of the railway bookstalls whereof its author, Mr. Thomas W. Jackson, has said it will sell forever and 1,000 years afterward. To this might be added another of Mr. Jackson's onslaughts on the human intelligence, I'm from Texas, you can't steer me, whereof is said, by the author, it is like a hard-boiled egg, you can't beat it. There are other of Mr. Jackson's books, whose titles escape memory, whereof he has said, they are a dynamite for sorrow. Nothing used to annoy Mifflin more than to have someone come in and ask for copies of these works. His brother-in-law, Andrew McGill, the writer, once gave him for Christmas, just to annoy him, a copy of On a Slow Train Through Arkansas sumptuously bound and gilded in what is known to the trade as dove-colored ooze. Roger retorted by sending Andrew, for his next birthday, 2 volumes of Brand the Iconoclast bound in what Robert Cortez Holliday calls embossed toadskin. But that is apart from the story. To the consideration of what to put on Miss Titania's bookshelf, Roger devoted the delighted hours of the morning. Several times Helen called him to come down and attend to the shop, but he was sitting on the floor, unaware of numbed shins, poring over the volumes he had carted upstairs for a final culling. It will be a great privilege, he said to himself, to have a young mind to experiment with. Now my wife, delightful creature though she is, was, well, distinctly mature when I had the good fortune to meet her. I have never been able properly to supervise her mental processes. But this Chapman girl will come to us wholly unlettered. Her father said she had been to a fashionable school. That surely is a guarantee that the delicate tendrils of her mind have never begun to sprout. I will test her, without her knowing it, by the books I put here for her. By noting which of them she responds to, I will know how to proceed. It might be worthwhile to shut up the shop one day a week in order to give her some brief talks on literature. Delightful. Let me see, a little series of talks on the development of the English novel, beginning with Tom Jones. That would hardly do. Well, I have always longed to be a teacher. This looks like a chance to begin. We might invite some of the neighbors to send in their children once a week and start a little school. Causeries du Lundi. In fact, who knows, I may yet be the St. Beuve of Brooklyn. Across his mind flashed a vision of newspaper clippings. This remarkable student of letters, who hides his brilliant parts under the unassuming existence of a second-hand bookseller, is now recognized as the Roger, called Mrs. Mifflin from downstairs. Front. Someone wants to know if you keep back numbers of foamy stories. After he had thrown out the intruder, Roger returned to his meditation. This selection, he mused, is of course only tentative. It is to act as a preliminary test, to see what sort of thing interests her. First of all, her name naturally suggests Shakespeare and the Elizabethans. It's a remarkable name, Titania Chapman. There must be great virtue in prunes. Let's begin with a volume of Christopher Marlowe. Then Keats, I guess. Every young person ought to shiver over St. Agnes' Eve on a bright cold winter evening. Over Bemerton's, certainly, because it's a bookshop story. Eugene Field's Tribune Primer to try out her sense of humor. And Archie, by all means, for the same reason. I'll go down and get the Archie scrapbook. It should be explained that Roger was a keen admirer of Don Marquis, the humorist of the New York Evening Sunday. Mr. Marquis once lived in Brooklyn, and the bookseller was never tired of saying that he was the most eminent author who had graced the borough since the days of Walt Whitman. Archie, the imaginary cockroach whom Mr. Marquis uses as a vehicle for so much excellent fun, was a constant delight to Roger, and he had kept a scrapbook of all Archie's clippings. This bulky tome he now brought out from the grotto by his desk where his particular treasures were kept. He ran his eye over it, and Mrs. Mifflin heard him utter shrill screams of laughter. "What on earth is it?" she asked. "Only Archie," he said, and began to read aloud. Down in a wine vault underneath the city 2 old men were sitting. They were drinking booze. Torn were their garments' hair, and beards were gritty. One had an overcoat, but hardly any shoes. Overhead the streetcars through the streets were running, filled with happy people going home to Christmas in the Adirondacks. The hunters, all were gunning. Big ships were sailing down by the isthmus. And came a little tot for to kiss her granny, such a little toddy, she could scarcely toddle, saying, "Kiss me, grandpa, kiss your little nanny," but the old man beamed her with a whiskey bottle. Outside the snowflakes began for to flutter. Far at sea the ships were sailing with the seamen. Not another word did Angel Nanny utter. Her grandsire chuckled and pledged the whiskey demon. Up spake the second man. He was worn and weary. Tears washed his face, which otherwise was pasty. She loved her parents who commuted on the Erie. "Brother, am afraid you struck a trifle hasty. She came to see you, all her pretty duds on, bringing Christmas posies from her mother's garden. Riding in the tunnel underneath the Hudson. Brother, was it rum caused your heart to harden?" "What on earth is there funny in that?" said Mrs. Mifflin. "Poor little lamb, I think it was terrible." "There's more of it," cried Roger, and opened his mouth to continue. "No more, thank you," said Helen. "There ought to be a fine for using the meter of love in the valley that way. I'm going out to market, so if the bell rings you'll have to answer it." Roger added the Archie scrapbook to Miss Titania's shelf and went on browsing over the volumes he had collected. "The nigger of the Narcissus," he said to himself, "for even if she doesn't read the story, perhaps she'll read the preface, which not marble nor the monuments of princes will outlive. Dickens' Christmas stories to introduce her to Mrs. Lirriper, the queen of landladies. Publishers tell me that Norfolk Street, Strand, is best known for the famous literary agent that has his office there, but I wonder how many of them know that that was where Mrs. Lirriper had her immortal lodgings? The notebooks of Samuel Butler, just to give her a little intellectual jazz. The Wrong Box, because it's the best farce in the language. Travels with a Donkey, to show her what good writing is like. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, to give her a sense of pity for human woes. Wait a minute, though. That's a pretty broad book for young ladies. I guess we'll put it aside and see what else there is. Some of Mr. Mosher's catalogs. Fine. They'll show her the true spirit of what one book lover calls bibliobliss. Walking stick papers. Yes, there are still good essayists running around. A bound file of the Publisher's Weekly to give her a smack of trade matters. Joe's Boys in case she needs a little relaxation. The Lays of Ancient Rome and Austin Dobson to show her some good poetry. I wonder if they give them the Lays to read in school nowadays? I have a horrible fear they are brought up on the Battle of Salamis and the brutal redcoats of '76. And now we'll be exceptionally subtle. We'll stick in a Robert Chambers to see if she falls for it. He viewed the shelf with pride. Not bad, he said to himself. I'll just add this Leonard Merrick, Whispers About Women, to amuse her. I bet that title will start her guessing. Helen will say I ought to have included the Bible, but I'll omit it on purpose, just to see whether the girl misses it. With typical male curiosity, he pulled out the bureau drawers to see what disposition his wife had made of them, and was pleased to find a little muslin bag of lavender dispersing a quiet fragrance in each. Very nice, he remarked. Very nice indeed. About the only thing missing is an ashtray. If Miss Titania is as modern as some of them, that'll be the first thing she'll call for. And maybe a copy of Ezra Pound's poems. I do hope she's not what Helen calls a Bolshevixen. There was nothing Bolshevik about a glittering limousine that drew up at the corner of Gissing and Swinburne Streets early that afternoon. A chauffeur in green livery opened the door, lifted out a suitcase of beautiful brown leather, and gave a respectful hand to the vision that emerged from depths of lilac-colored upholstery. Where do you want me to carry the bag, miss? This is the bitter parting, replied Miss Titania. I don't want you to know my address, Edwards. Some of my mad friends might worm it out of you, and I don't want them coming down and bothering me. I am going to be very busy with literature. I'll walk the rest of the way." Edwards saluted with a grin. He worshipped the original young heiress and returned to his wheel. "There's one thing I want you to do for me," said Titania. "Call up my father and tell him I'm on the job." "Yes, miss," said Edwards, who would have run the limousine into a government motor truck if she had ordered it. Miss Chapman's small gloved hand descended into an interesting purse that was cuffed to her wrist with a bright little chain. She drew out a nickel. It was characteristic of her that it was a very bright and engaging-looking nickel, and handed it gravely to her charioteer. Equally gravely he saluted, and the car, after moving through certain dignified arcs, swam swiftly away down Thackeray Boulevard. Titania, after making sure that Edwards was out of sight, turned up Gissing Street with a fluent pace and an observant eye. A small boy cried, "Carry your bag, lady," and she was about to agree, but then remembered that she was now engaged at $10 a week and waved him away. Our readers would feel a justifiable grudge if we did not attempt a description of the young lady, and we will employ the few blocks of her course along Gissing Street for this purpose. Walking behind her, the observer, by the time she had reached Clemens Place, would have seen that she was faultlessly tailored in genial tweeds, that her small brown boots were sheltered by spats of that pale tan complexion exhibited by Pullman porters on the Pennsylvania Railroad, that her person was both slender and vigorous, that her shoulders were carrying a sumptuous fur of the color described by the trade as nutria, or possibly opal smoke. The word chinchilla would have occurred irresistibly to this observer from behind. He might also, if he were the father of a family, have had a fleeting vision of many autographed stubs in a checkbook. The general impression that he would have retained, had he turned aside at Clemens Place, would be expensive, but worth the expense. It is more likely, however, that the student of phenomena would have continued along Gissing Street to the next corner, being that of Hazlitt Street. Taking advantage of opportunity, he would overtake the lady on the pavement with a secret, sidelong glance. If he were wise, he would pass her on the right side where her tilted bonnet permitted a wider angle of vision. He would catch a glimpse of cheek and chin belonging to the category known, and rightly, as adorable. Hair that held sunlight through the dullest day. Even a small platinum wristwatch that might pardonably be excused, in its exhilarating career, for beating a trifle fast. Among the grayish furs he would note a bunch of such violets as never bloom in the crude springtime, but reserve themselves for November and the plate glass windows of Fifth Avenue. It is probable that whatever the errand of this spectator, he would have continued along Gissing Street a few paces farther. Then, with calculated innocence, he would have halted halfway up the block that leads to the Wordsworth Avenue L, and looked backward with carefully simulated irresolution, as though considering some forgotten matter. With apparently unseeing eyes, he would have scanned the bright pedestrian, and caught the full impact of her rich blue gaze. He would have seen a small, resolute face rather vivacious in effect, yet with a quaint pathos of youth and eagerness. He would have noted the cheeks lit with excitement and rapid movement in the bracing air. He would certainly have noted the delicate contrast of the fur of the wild nutria with the soft V of her bare throat. Then, to his surprise, he would have seen this attractive person stop, examine her surroundings, and run down some steps into a rather dingy-looking second-hand bookshop. He would have gone about his affairs with a new and surprised conviction that the Almighty had the borough of Brooklyn under his especial care. Roger, who had conceived a notion of some rather peevish foundling of the Ritz-Carlton lobbies and Central Park riding academies, was agreeably amazed by the sweet simplicity of the young lady. "Is this Mr. Mifflin?" she said, as he advanced all agog from his smoky corner. "Miss Chapman," he replied, taking her bag. "Helen," he called, "Miss Titania is here." She looked about the somber alcoves of the shop. "I do think it's adorable of you to take me in," she said. "Dad has told me so much about you. He says I'm impossible. I suppose this is the literature he talks about. I want to know all about it. And here's Bach," she cried. "Dad says he's the greatest dog in the world, named after Botticelli or somebody. I've brought him a present. It's in my bag. Nice old Bachy." Bach, who was unaccustomed to spats, was examining them after his own fashion. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Mifflin, "we are delighted to see you. I hope you'll be happy with us, but I rather doubt it. Mr. Mifflin is a hard man to get along with." "Oh, I'm sure of it," cried Titania. "I mean, I'm sure I shall be happy. You mustn't believe a word of what Dad says about me. I'm crazy about books. I don't see how you can bear to sell them. I brought these violets for you, Mrs. Mifflin." "How perfectly sweet of you," said Helen, captivated already. "Come along. We'll put them right in water. I'll show you your room." Roger heard them moving about overhead. It suddenly occurred to him that the shop was rather a dingy place for a young girl. "I wish I had thought to get in a cash register," he mused. "She'll think I'm terribly unbusinesslike." "Now," said Mrs. Mifflin, as she and Titania came downstairs again, "I'm making some pastry, so I'm going to turn you over to your employer. He can show you round the shop and tell you where all the books are." "Before we begin," said Titania, "just let me give Bach his present." She showed a large package of tissue paper and, unwinding innumerable layers, finally disclosed a stalwart bone. "I was lunching at Sherry's, and I made the head waiter give me this." He was awfully amused. "Come along into the kitchen and give it to him," said Helen. "He'll be your friend for life." "What an adorable kennel!" cried Titania, when she saw the remodeled packing case that served Bach as a retreat. The bookseller's ingenious carpentry had built it into the similitude of a Carnegie library, with the sign reading room over the door, and he had painted imitation bookshelves along the interior. "You'll get used to Mr. Mifflin after a while," said Helen amusedly. "He spent all one winter getting that kennel fixed to his liking. You might have thought he was going to live in it instead of Bach. All the titles that he painted in there are books that have dogs in them, and a lot of them he made up." Titania insisted on getting down to peer inside. Bach was much flattered at this attention from the new planet that had swum into his kennel. "Gracious," she said, "here's the Rubaiyat of Omar Canine. I do think that's clever." "Oh, there are a lot more," said Helen. "The works of Bonnerlaw and Bond's classics, and catechisms on dogma, and goodness knows what. If Roger paid half as much attention to business as he does to jokes of that sort, we'd be rich. Now, you run along and have a look at the shop." Titania found the bookseller at his desk. "Here I am, Mr. Mifflin," she said. "See, I brought a nice sharp pencil along with me to make out sales slips. I've been practicing sticking it in my hair. I can do it quite nicely now. I hope you have some of those big red books with all the carbon paper in them and everything. I've been watching the girls up at Lord & Taylor's make them out, and I think they're fascinating. And you must teach me to run the elevator. I'm awfully keen about elevators." "Bless me," said Roger. "You'll find this very different from Lord & Taylor's. We haven't any elevators, or any sales slips, or even a cash register. We don't wait on customers unless they ask us to. They come in and browse round, and if they find anything they want, they come back here to my desk and ask about it. The price is marked in every book in red pencil. The cash box is here on this shelf. This is the key hanging on this little hook. I enter each sale in this ledger. When you sell a book, you must write it down here, and the price paid for it." "But suppose it's charged," said Titania. "No charge accounts. Everything is cash. If someone comes in to sell books, you must refer him to me. You mustn't be surprised to see people drop in here and spend several hours reading. Lots of them look on this as a kind of club. I hope you don't mind the smell of tobacco, for almost all the men that come here smoke in the shop. You see, I put ashtrays around for them." "I love tobacco smell," said Titania. "Daddy's library at home smells something like this, but not quite so strong. And I want to see the worms. Bookworms, you know. Daddy said you had lots of them." "You'll see them, all right," said Roger, chuckling. "They come in and out. Tomorrow I'll show you how my stock is arranged. It'll take you quite a while to get familiar with it. Until then, I just want you to poke around and see what there is, until you know the shelves so well you could put your hand on any given book in the dark. That's a game my wife and I used to play. We would turn off all the lights at night, and I would call out the title of a book and see how near she could come to finding it. Then I would take a turn. When we came more than 6 inches away from it, we would have to pay a forfeit. It's great fun." "What larks we'll have," cried Titania. "I do think this is a cunning place. This is the bulletin board, where I put up notices about books that interest me. Here's a card I've just been writing." Roger drew from his pocket a square of cardboard, and affixed it to the board with a thumbtack. Titania read, "The book that should have prevented the war. Now that the fighting is over is a good time to read Thomas Hardy's The Dynasts. I don't want to sell it, because it is one of the greatest treasures I own. But if anyone will guarantee to read all 3 volumes, and let them sink into his mind, I'm willing to lend them." If enough thoughtful Germans had read The Dynast before July 1914, there would have been no war. If every delegate to the peace conference could be made to read it before the sessions begin, there will be no more wars. R. Mifflin. "Dear me," said Titania, "is it so good as all that? Perhaps I'd better read it. It is so good that if I knew any way of doing so I'd insist on Mr. Wilson reading it on his voyage to France. I wish I could get it onto his ship. My, what a book. It makes one positively ill with pity and terror. Sometimes I wake up at night and look out of the window and imagine I hear Hardy laughing. I get him a little mixed up with the deity, I fear. But he's a bit too hard for you to tackle." Titania was puzzled and said nothing, but her busy mind made a note of its own. "Hardy, hard to read, makes one ill, try it." "What did you think of the books I put in your room?" said Roger. He had vowed to wait until she made some comment unsolicited, but he could not restrain himself. "In my room," she said. "Why, I'm sorry, I never noticed them." Chapter 4. The Disappearing Volume. "Well, my dear," said Roger after supper that evening, "I think perhaps we had better introduce Miss Titania to our custom of reading aloud." "Perhaps it would bore her," said Helen. "You know it isn't everybody that likes being read to." "Oh, I should love it," exclaimed Titania. "I don't think anybody ever read to me, that is not since I was a child." "Suppose we leave you to look after the shop," said Helen to Roger in a teasing mood, "and I'll take Titania out to the movies. I think Tarzan is still running." Whatever private impulses Miss Chapman may have felt, she saw by the bookseller's downcast face that a visit to Tarzan would break his heart, and she was prompt to disclaim any taste for the screen classic. "Dear me," she said, "Tarzan. That's all that nature stuff by John Burroughs, isn't it? Oh, Mrs. Mifflin, I think it would be very tedious. Let's have Mr. Mifflin read to us. I'll get down my knitting bag." "You mustn't mind being interrupted," said Helen. "When anybody rings the bell Roger has to run out and tend the shop." "You must let me do it," said Titania. "I want to earn my wages, you know." "All right," said Mrs. Mifflin. "Roger, you settle Miss Chapman in the den and give her something to look at while we do the dishes." But Roger was all on fire to begin the reading. "Why don't we postpone the dishes," he said, "just to celebrate?" "Let me help," insisted Titania. "I should think washing up would be great fun." "No, no, not on your first evening," said Helen. "Mr. Mifflin and I will finish them in a jiffy." So Roger poked up the coal fire in the den, disposed the chairs, and gave Titania a copy of Sartor Resartus to look at. He then vanished into the kitchen with his wife, whence Titania heard the cheerful clank of crockery in a dishpan and the splashing of hot water. "The best thing about washing up," she heard Roger say, "is that it makes one's hands so clean, a novel sensation for a second-hand bookseller." She gave Sartor Resartus what is graphically described as a once-over, and then seeing the Morning Times lying on the table, picked it up, as she had not read it. Her eye fell upon the column headed, "Lost and found 50 cents in agate line," and as she had recently lost a little pearl brooch, she ran hastily through it. She chuckled a little over. "Lost, Hotel Imperial Lavatory, set of teeth. Call or communicate Steele, 134 East 43 St. Reward, no questions asked." Then she saw this. "Lost, copy of Thomas Carlyle's Oliver Cromwell, between Gissing Street, Brooklyn, and the Octagon Hotel. If found before midnight, Tuesday, December 3rd, returned to assistant chef, Octagon Hotel." "Why," she exclaimed, "Gissing Street, that's here. And what a funny kind of book for an assistant chef to read. No wonder their lunches have been so bad lately." When Roger and Helen rejoined her in the den a few minutes later, she showed the bookseller the advertisement. He was very much excited. "That's a funny thing," he said. "There's something queer about that book. Did I tell you about it? Last Tuesday. I know it was then because it was the evening young Gilbert was here. A man with a beard came in asking for it, and it wasn't on the shelf. Then the next night, Wednesday, I was up very late writing and fell asleep at my desk. I must have left the front door ajar, because I was waked up by the draft, and when I went to close the door I saw the book sticking out a little beyond the others, in its usual place. And last night, when the corn cobs were here, I went out to look up a quotation in it, and it was gone again. Perhaps the assistant chef stole it, said Titania. But if so, why the deuce would he advertise having done so? Asked Roger. Well, if he did steal it, said Helen, I wish him joy of it. I tried to read it once. You talked so much about it, and I found it dreadfully dull. If he did steal it, cried the bookseller, I'm perfectly delighted. It shows that my contention is right. People do really care for good books. If an assistant chef is so fond of good books that he has to steal them, the world is safe for democracy. Usually the only books anyone wants to steal are sheer piffle, like Making Life Worthwhile by Douglas Fairbanks or Mother Shipton's Book of Oracles. I don't mind a man stealing books if he steals good ones. You see the remarkable principles that govern this business, said Helen to Titania. They sat down by the fire and took up their knitting while the bookseller ran out to see if the volume had by any chance returned to his shelves. Is it there? Said Helen, when he came back. No, said Roger, and picked up the advertisement again. I wonder why he wants it returned before midnight on Tuesday? So he can read it in bed, I guess, said Helen. Perhaps he suffers from insomnia. It's a darn shame he lost it before he had a chance to read it. I'd like to have known what he thought of it. I've got a great mind to go up and call on him. Charge it off to profit and loss and forget about it, said Helen. How about that reading aloud? Roger ran his eye along his private shelves and pulled down a well-worn volume. Now that Thanksgiving is past, he said, my mind always turns to Christmas, and Christmas means Charles Dickens. My dear, would it bore you if we had a go at the old Christmas stories? Mrs. Mifflin held up her hands in mock dismay. He reads them to me every year at this time, she said to Titania. Still, they're worth it. I know good old Mrs. Lirriper better than I do most of my friends. What is it, the Christmas Carol? Said Titania. We had to read that in school. No, said Roger. The other story's infinitely better. Everybody gets the carol dinned into them until they're weary of it. But no one nowadays seems to read the others. I tell you, Christmas wouldn't be Christmas to me if I didn't read these tales over again every year. How homesick they make one for the good old days of real inns and real beefsteak and real ale drawn in pewter. My dears, sometimes when I am reading Dickens I get a vision of rare sirloin with floury boiled potatoes and plenty of horseradish, set on a shining cloth not far from a blaze of English coal. He's an incorrigible visionary, said Mrs. Mifflin. To hear him talk you might think no one had had a square meal since Dickens died. You might think that all landladies died with Mrs. Lirriper. Very ungrateful of him, said Titania. I'm sure I couldn't ask for better potatoes, or a nicer hostess, than I've found in Brooklyn. Well, well, said Roger. You were right, of course. And yet something went out of the world when Victorian England vanished, something that will never come again. Take the stagecoach drivers, for instance. What a racy, human type they were. And what have we now to compare with them? Subway guards? Taxicab drivers? I have hung around many an all-night lunchroom to hear the chauffeurs talk, but they are too much on the move. You can't get the picture of them the way Dickens could of his types. You can't catch that sort of thing in a snapshot, you know. You have to have a time exposure. I'll grant you, though, that lunchroom food is mighty good. The best place to eat is always a counter where the chauffeurs congregate. They get awfully hungry, you see, driving round in the cold, and when they want food they want it hot and tasty. There's a little hash alley called Frank's, up on Broadway near 77th, where I guess the ham and eggs and French fried is as good as any Mr. Pickwick ever ate. I must get Edwards to take me there, said Titania. Edwards is our chauffeur. I've been to the Ansonia for tea, that's near there. Better keep away, said Helen. When Roger comes home from those places he smells so strong of onions it brings tears to my eyes. We've just been talking about an assistant chef, said Roger. That suggests that I read you somebody's luggage, which is all about a head waiter. I have often wished I could get a job as a waiter or a busboy, just to learn if there really are any such headwaiters nowadays. You know, there are all sorts of jobs I'd like to have, just to fructify my knowledge of human nature and find out whether life is really as good as literature. I'd love to be a waiter, a barber, a floor walker. Roger, my dear, said Helen, why don't you get on with the reading? Roger knocked out his pipe, turned back out of his chair, and sat down with infinite relish to read the memorable character sketch of Christopher, the head waiter, which is dear to every lover of taverns. The writer of these humble lines being a waiter, he began. The knitting needles flashed with diligence, and the dog by the fender stretched himself out in the luxuriant vacancy of mind only known to dogs surrounded by a happy group of their friends. And Roger, enjoying himself enormously, and particularly pleased by the chuckles of his audience, was approaching the ever-delightful items of the coffee-room bill, which is to be found about 10 pages on in the first chapter. How sad it is that hotel bills are not so rendered in these times, when the bell in the shop clanged. Picking up his pipe and matchbox, and grumbling, "It's always the way," he hurried out of the room. He was agreeably surprised to find that his caller was the young advertising man, Aubrey Gilbert. "Hello," he said. "I've been saving something for you. It's a quotation from Joseph Conrad about advertising." "Good enough," said Aubrey. "And I've got something for you. You were so nice to me the other evening, I took the liberty of bringing you round some tobacco. Here's a tin of blue-eyed mixture. It's my favorite. I hope you'll like it. Bully for you. Perhaps I ought to let you off the Conrad quotation since you're so kind." "Not a bit. I suppose it's a knock." "Shoot." The bookseller led the way back to his desk, where he rummaged among the litter and finally found a scrap of paper on which he had written, "Being myself animated by feelings of affection toward my fellow men, I am saddened by the modern system of advertising. Whatever evidence it offers of enterprise, ingenuity, impudence, and resource in certain individuals, it proves to my mind the wide prevalence of that form of mental degradation which is called gullibility." Joseph Conrad. "What do you think of that?" said Roger. "You'll find that in the story called The Anarchist." "I think less than nothing of it," said Aubrey. "As your friend Don Marquis observed the other evening, an idea isn't always to be blamed for the people who believe in it. Mr. Conrad has been reading some quack ads, that's all. Because there are fake ads, that doesn't condemn the principle of publicity. But look here, what I really came round to see you for is to show you this. It was in the Times this morning." He pulled out of his pocket a clipping of the lost insertion to which Roger's attention had already been drawn. "Yes, I've just seen it," said Roger. "I missed the book from my shelves, and I believe someone must have stolen it." "Well, now, I want to tell you something," said Aubrey. "Tonight I had dinner at the Octagon with Mr. Chapman." "Is that so?" said Roger. "You know his daughter's here now." "So he told me. It's rather interesting how it all works out. You see, after you told me the other day that Miss Chapman was coming to work for you, that gave me an idea. I knew her father would be specially interested in Brooklyn on that account, and it suggested to me an idea for a window display campaign here in Brooklyn for the Daintybits products. You know we handle all his sales promotion campaigns. Of course I didn't let on that I knew about his daughter coming over here, but he told me about it himself in the course of our talk. Well, here's what I'm getting at. We had dinner in the Czechoslovak Grill, up on the 14th floor, and going up in the elevator I saw the man in a chef's uniform carrying a book. I looked over his shoulder to see what it was. I thought of course it would be a cookbook. It was a copy of Oliver Cromwell. So he found it again. I must go and have a talk with that chap. If he's a Carlyle fan, I'd like to know him. Wait a minute. I had seen the lost ad in the paper this morning, because I always look over that column. Often it gives me ideas for advertising stunts. If you keep an eye on the things people are anxious to get back, you know what they really prize. And if you know what they prize, you can get a line on what goods ought to be advertised more extensively. This was the first time I had ever noticed a lost ad for a book. So I thought to myself, the book business is coming up. Well, when I saw the chef with the book in his hand, I said to him jokingly, "I see you found it again." He was a foreign-looking fellow, with a big beard, which is unusual for a chef, because I suppose it's likely to get in the soup. He looked at me as though I'd run a carving knife into him. Almost scared me the way he looked. "Yes, yes," he said, and shoved the book out of sight under his arm. He seemed half angry and half frightened. So I thought maybe he had no right to be riding in the passenger elevator and was scared someone would report him to the manager. Just as we were getting to the 14th floor, I said to him in a whisper, "It's all right, old chap. I'm not going to report you." I give you my word, he looked more scared than before. He went quite white. I got off at the 14th, and he followed me out. I thought he was going to speak to me, but Mr. Chapman was there in the lobby, and he didn't have a chance. But I noticed that he watched me into the grill room as though I was his last chance of salvation. "I guess the poor devil was scared you'd report him to the police for stealing the book," said Roger. "Never mind, let him have it." "Did he steal it?" "I haven't a notion, but somebody did, because it disappeared from here." "Well now, wait a minute. Here's the queer part of it. I didn't think anything more about it, except that it was a funny coincidence my seeing him after having noticed that ad in the paper. I had a long talk with Mr. Chapman, and we discussed some plans for a prune and Saratoga chip campaign, and I showed him some suggested copy I had prepared. Then he told me about his daughter, and I let on that I knew you. I left the Octagon about 8 o'clock, and I thought I'd run over here on the subway just to show you the lost notice and give you this tobacco. And when I got off the subway at Atlantic Avenue, who should I see but friend Chef again. He got off the same train I did. He had on civilian clothes then, of course, and when he was out of his white uniform and pancake hat I recognized him right off. Who do you suppose it was?" "Can't imagine," said Roger, highly interested by this time. "Why, the professor-looking guy who came in to ask for the book the first night I was here." "Humph. Well, he must be keen about Carlyle, because he was horribly disappointed that evening when he asked for the book and I couldn't find it. I remember how he insisted that I must have it, and I hunted all through the history shelves to make sure it hadn't got misplaced. He said that some friend of his had seen it here, and he had come right round to buy it. I told him he could certainly get a copy at the public library, and he said that wouldn't do at all." "Well, I think he's nuts," said Aubrey, "because I'm damn sure he followed me down the street after I left the subway. I stopped in at the drugstore on the corner to get some matches, and when I came out, there he was underneath the lamppost." "If it was a modern author, instead of Carlyle," said Roger, "I'd say it was some publicity stunt pulled off by the publishers. You know they go to all manner of queer dodges to get an author's name in print. But Carlyle's copyrights expired long ago, so I don't see the game. I guess he's picketing your place to try and steal the formula for Eggs Samuel Butler," said Aubrey, and they both laughed. "You'd better come in and meet my wife and Miss Chapman," said Roger. The young man made some feeble demur, but it was obvious to the bookseller that he was vastly elated at the idea of making Miss Chapman's acquaintance. "Here's a friend of mine," said Roger, ushering Aubrey into the little room where Helen and Titania were still sitting by the fire. "Mrs. Mifflin, Mr. Aubrey Gilbert, Miss Chapman, Mr. Gilbert." Aubrey was vaguely aware of the rows of books, of the shining coals, of the buxom hostess and the friendly terrier. But with the intense focus of an intelligent young male mind, these were all merely appurtenances to the congenial spectacle of the employee. How quickly a young man's senses assemble and assimilate the data that are really relevant. Without seeming even to look in that direction, he had performed the most amazing feat of lightning calculation known to the human faculties. He had added up all the young ladies of his acquaintance and found the sum total less than the girl before him. He had subtracted the new phenomenon from the universe as he knew it, including the solar system and the advertising business, and found the remainder a minus quantity. He had multiplied the contents of his intellect by a factor he had no reason to assume constant, and was startled at what teachers call, I believe, the product. And he had divided what was in the left-hand armchair into his own career, and found no room for a quotient. All of which transpired in the length of time necessary for Roger to push forward another chair. With the politeness desirable in a well-bred youth, Aubrey's first instinct was to make himself square with the hostess. Resolutely he occluded blue eyes, silk shirtwaist, and admirable chin from his mental vision. "It's awfully good of you to let me come in," he said to Mrs. Mifflin. "I was here the other evening and Mr. Mifflin insisted on my staying to supper with him." "I'm very glad to see you," said Helen. "Roger told me about you. I hope he didn't poison you with any of his outlandish dishes." Wait till he tries you with brandied peaches a la Harold Bellwright." Aubrey uttered some genial reassurance, still making the supreme sacrifice of keeping his eyes away from where, he felt, they belonged. "Mr. Gilbert has just had a queer experience," said Roger. "Tell them about it." In the most reckless way, Aubrey permitted himself to be impaled upon a direct and interested flash of blue lightning. "I was having dinner with your father at the Octagon." The high-tension voltage of that bright blue current felt like Om Sweet Om, but Aubrey dared not risk too much of it at once. Fearing to blow out a fuse, he turned in panic to Mrs. Mifflin. "You see," he explained, "I write a good deal of Mr. Chapman's advertising for him. We had an appointment to discuss some business matters. We're planning a big barrage on prunes." "Dad works much too hard, don't you think?" said Titania. Aubrey welcomed this as a pleasant avenue of discussion leading into the parkland of Miss Chapman's family affairs. But Roger insisted on his telling the story of the chef and the copy of Cromwell. "And he followed you here," exclaimed Titania. "What fun! I had no idea the book business was so exciting." "Better lock the door tonight, Roger," said Mrs. Mifflin, "or he may walk off with a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica." "Why, my dear," said Roger, "I think this is grand news. Here's a man, in a humble walk of life, so keen about good books that he even pickets a bookstore on the chance of swiping some. It's the most encouraging thing I've ever heard of. I must write to the Publishers Weekly about it." "Well," said Aubrey, "you mustn't let me interrupt your little party." "You're not interrupting," said Roger. "We were only reading aloud. Do you know Dickens' Christmas stories?" "I'm afraid I don't." "Suppose we go on reading, shall we?" "Please do." "Yes, do go on," said Titania. Mr. Mifflin was just reading about a most adorable headwaiter in a London chophouse. Aubrey begged permission to light his pipe, and Roger picked up the book. "But before we read the items of the coffee room bill," he said, "I think it only right that we should have a little refreshment. This passage should never be read without something to accompany it. My dear, what do you say to a glass of sherry all round?" "It is sad to have to confess it," said Mrs. Mifflin to Titania. "Mr. Mifflin can never read Dickens without having something to drink. I think the sale of Dickens will fall off terribly when Prohibition comes in. I once took the trouble to compile a list of the amount of liquor drunk in Dickens' works," said Roger, "and I assure you the total was astounding. 7,000 hogsheads, I believe it was. Calculations of that sort are great fun. I have always intended to write a little essay on the rainstorms in the stories of Robert Louis Stevenson. You see, our L.S. was a Scot and well acquainted with wet weather. Excuse me a moment. I'll just run down cellar and get up a bottle." Roger left the room, and they heard his steps passing down into the cellar. Bach, after the manner of dogs, followed him. The smells of cellars are a rare treat to dogs, especially ancient Brooklyn cellars which have a cachet all their own. The cellar of the Haunted Bookshop was, to Bach, a fascinating place, illuminated by a warm glow from the furnace, and piled high with split packing cases which Roger used as kindling. From below came the rasp of a shovel among coal, and the clear, musical slither as the lumps were thrown from the iron scoop onto the fire. Just then the bell rang in the shop. "Let me go," said Titania, jumping up. "Can't I?" said Aubrey. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Mifflin, laying down her knitting. "Neither of you knows anything about the stock. Sit down and be comfortable. I'll be right back." Aubrey and Titania looked at each other with a touch of embarrassment. "Your father sent you his kind regards," said Aubrey. That was not what he had intended to say, but somehow he could not utter the word. He said not to read all the books at once. Titania laughed. "How funny that you should run into him just when you were coming here. He's a duck, isn't he?" "Well, you see, I only know him in a business way, but he certainly is a corker. He believes in advertising, too. Are you crazy about books?" "Why, I never really had very much to do with them. I'm afraid you'll think I'm terribly ignorant." "Not at all. I'm awfully glad to meet someone who doesn't think it's a crime not to have read all the books there are. This is a queer kind of place, isn't it?" "Yes, it's a funny idea to call it the Haunted Bookshop. I wonder what it means." Mr. Mifflin told me it meant haunted by the ghosts of great literature. I hope they won't annoy you. The ghost of Thomas Carlyle seems to be pretty active. I'm not afraid of ghosts, said Titania. Aubrey gazed at the fire. He wanted to say that he intended from now on to do a little haunting on his own account, but he did not know just how to break it gently. And then Roger returned from the cellar with the bottle of sherry. As he was uncorking it, they heard the shop door close, and Mrs. Mifflin came in. Well, Roger, she said, if you think so much of your old Cromwell, you'd better keep it in here. Here it is. She laid the book on the table. For the love of Mike, exclaimed Roger. Who brought it back? I guess it was your friend the assistant chef, said Mrs. Mifflin. Anyway, he had a beard like a Christmas tree. He was mighty polite. He said he was terribly absent-minded, and that the other day he was in here looking at some books and just walked off with it without knowing what he was doing. He offered to pay for the trouble he had caused, but of course I wouldn't let him. I asked if he wanted to see you, but he said he was in a hurry. I'm almost disappointed, said Roger. I thought that I had turned up a real book lover. Here we are. All hands drink the health of Mr. Thomas Carlyle. The toast was drunk, and they settled themselves in their chairs. And here's to the new employee, said Helen. This also was dispatched, Aubrey draining his glass with a zeal which did not escape Miss Chapman's discerning eye. Roger then put out his hand for the Dickens. But first he picked up his beloved Cromwell. He looked at it carefully, and then held the volume close to the light. The mystery's not over yet, he said. It's been rebound. This isn't the original binding. Are you sure? Said Helen in surprise. It looks the same. The binding has been cleverly imitated, but it can't fool me. In the first place, there was a rubbed corner at the top, and there was an ink stain on one of the end papers. There's still a stain there, said Aubrey, looking over his shoulder. Yes, but not the same stain. I've had that book long enough to know it by heart. Now what the deuce would that lunatic want to have it rebound for? Goodness gracious, said Helen. Put it away and forget about it. We'll all be dreaming about Carlyle if you're not careful. Chapter 5. Aubrey walks partway home and rides the rest of the way. It was a cold, clear night as Mr. Aubrey Gilbert left the Haunted Bookshop that evening and set out to walk homeward. Without making a very conscious choice, he felt instinctively that it would be agreeable to walk back to Manhattan rather than permit the roaring disillusion of the subway to break in upon his meditations. It is to be feared that Aubrey would have badly flunked any quizzing on the chapters of Somebody's Luggage which the bookseller had read aloud. His mind was swimming rapidly in the agreeable, unfettered fashion of a stream rippling downhill. As O. Henry puts it in one of his most delightful stories, he was outwardly decent and managed to preserve his aquarium, but inside he was impromptu and full of unexpectedness. To say that he was thinking of Miss Chapman would imply too much power of ratiocination and abstract scrutiny on his part. He was not thinking. He was being thought. Down the accustomed channels of his intellect, he felt his mind ebbing with the irresistible movement of tides drawn by the blandishing moon. And across these shimmering estuaries of impulse his will, a lost and naked athlete, was painfully attempting to swim, but making much leeway and already almost resigned to being carried out to sea. He stopped a moment at Weintraub's drug store, on the corner of Gissing Street and Wordsworth Avenue, to buy some cigarettes, unfailing solace of an agitated bosom. It was the usual old-fashioned pharmacy of those parts of Brooklyn. Tall red, green, and blue vases of liquid in the windows threw blotches of colored light onto the pavement. On the panes was a fixed white china lettering, H. Weintraub, Dut Che Apotheker. Inside, the customary shelves of labeled jars, glass cases holding cigars, nostrums, and toilet knickknacks, and in one corner an ancient revolving bookcase deposited long ago by the Tabard Library. The shop was empty, but as he opened the door a bell buzzed sharply. In a back chamber he could hear voices. As he waited idly for the druggist to appear, Aubrey cast a tolerant eye over the dusty volumes in the twirling case. There were the usual copies of Harold McGrath's The Man on the Box, A Girl of the Limberlost, and The Houseboat on the Styx. The Divine Fire, much grimed, leaned against Joe Chappell's Heart Throbs. Those familiar with the Tabard bookcases still to be found in outlying drug shops know that the stock has not been turned for many a year. Aubrey was the more surprised, on spinning the case round, to find wedged in between two other volumes the empty cover of a book that had been torn loose from the pages to which it belonged. He glanced at the lettering on the back. It ran thus: Carlyle, Oliver Cromwell's Letters and Speeches. Obeying a sudden impulse, he slipped the book cover in his overcoat pocket. Mr. Weintraub entered the shop, a solid Teutonic person with discolored pouches under his eyes and a face that was a potent argument for prohibition. His manner, however, was that of one anxious to please. Aubrey indicated the brand of cigarettes he wanted, having himself coined the advertising catchword for them. They're mild, but they satisfy. He felt a certain loyal compulsion always to smoke this kind. The druggist held out the packet, and Aubrey noticed that his fingers were stained a deep saffron color. "I see you're a cigarette smoker, too," said Aubrey pleasantly, as he opened the packet and lit one of the paper tubes at a little alcohol flame burning in a globe of blue glass on the counter. "Me? I never smoke," said Mr. Weintraub, with a smile which somehow did not seem to fit his surly face. "I must have steady nerves in my profession. Apothecaries who smoke make up bad prescriptions." "Well, how do you get your hands stained that way?" Mr. Weintraub removed his hands from the counter. "Chemicals," he grunted. "Prescriptions, all that sort of thing." "Well," said Aubrey, "smoking's a bad habit. I guess I do too much of it." He could not resist the impression that someone was listening to their talk. The doorway at the back of the shop was veiled by a portiere of beads and thin bamboo sections threaded on strings. He heard them clicking as though they had been momentarily pulled aside. Turning, just as he opened the door to leave, he noticed the bamboo curtain swaying. "Well, good night," he said, and stepped out onto the street. As he walked down Wordsworth Avenue, under the thunder of the L, past lighted lunchrooms, oyster saloons, and pawn shops, Miss Chapman resumed her sway. With the delightful velocity of thought, his mind whirled in a narrowing spiral round the experience of the evening. The small book-crammed sitting room of the Mifflins, the sparkling fire, the lively chirrup of the bookseller reading aloud, and there, in the old easy chair whose horsehair stuffing was bulging out, that blue-eyed vision of careless girlhood. Happily he had been so seated that he could study her without seeming to do so. The line of her ankle where the firelight danced upon it put Coles Phillips to shame, he averred. Extraordinary, how these creatures are made to torment us with their intolerable comeliness. Against the background of dusky bindings her head shone with a soft haze of gold. Her face, that had an air of naive and provoking independence, made him angry with its unnecessary surplus of enchantment. An unaccountable gust of rage drove him rapidly along the frozen street. "Damn it," he cried. "What right has any girl to be as pretty as that? Why, I'd like to beat her," he muttered, amazed at himself. "What the devil right has a girl got to look so innocently adorable?" It would be unseemly to follow poor Aubrey in his vacillations of rage and worship as he thrashed along Wordsworth Avenue, hearing and seeing no more than was necessary for the preservation of his life at street crossings. Half-smoked cigarette stubs glowed in his wake. His burly bosom echoed with incoherent oratory. In the darker stretches of Fulton Street that lead up to the Brooklyn Bridge, he fiercely exclaimed, "By God, it's not such a bad world." As he ascended the slope of that vast airy span, a black midget against a froth of stars, he was gravely planning such vehemence of exploit in the advertising profession as would make it seem less absurd to approach the president of the Daintybits Corporation with a question for which no progenitor of loveliness is ever quite prepared. In the exact center of the bridge, something diluted his mood. He halted, leaning against the railing, to consider the splendor of the scene. The hour was late, moving on toward midnight, but in the tall black precipices of Manhattan scattered lights gleamed, in an odd, irregular pattern like the sparse punctures on the raffle board. Take a chance on a milk-fed turkey, the East Indian elevator boy presents to apartment house tenants about Halloween. A fume of golden light eddied over uptown merriment. He could see the ruby beacon on the Metropolitan Tower signal 3/4. Underneath the airy decking of the bridge a tug went puffing by, her port and starboard lamps trailing red and green threads over the tideway. Some great argosy of the Staten Island fleet swept serenely down to St. George, past Liberty in her soft robe of light, carrying theatered commuters, dazed with weariness and blinking at the raw fury of the electric bulbs. Overhead the night was a superb arch of clear frost, sifted with stars. Blue sparks crackled stickily along the trolley wires as the cars groaned over the bridge. Aubrey surveyed all this splendid scene without exact observation. He was of a philosophic turn, and was attempting to console his discomfiture in the overwhelming luster of Miss Titania by the thought that she was, after all, the creature and offspring of the science he worshipped, that of advertising. Was not the fragrance of her presence, the soft compulsion of her gaze, even the delirious frill of muslin at her wrist, to be set down to the credit of his chosen art? Had he not, pondering obscurely upon attention-compelling copy and layout and typeface, in a corner of the gray matter office, contributed to the triumphant prosperity and grace of this unconscious beneficiary? Indeed, she seemed to him, fiercely tormenting himself with her loveliness, a symbol of the mysterious and subtle power of publicity. It was advertising that had done this, that had enabled Mr. Chapman, a shy and droll little person, to surround this girl with all the fructifying glories of civilization, to foster and cherish her until she shone upon the earth like a morning star. Advertising had clothed her. Advertising had fed her, schooled, roofed, and sheltered her. In a sense, she was the crowning advertisement of her father's career, and her innocent perfection taunted him just as much as the bright sky sign he knew was flashing the words Chapman Prunes above the teeming pavements of Times Square. He groaned to think that he himself, by his conscientious labors, had helped to put this girl in such a position that he could hardly dare approach her. He would never have approached her again, on any pretext, if the intensity of his thoughts had not caused him, unconsciously, to grip the railing of the bridge with strong and angry hands. For at that moment a sack was thrown over his head from behind, and he was violently seized by the legs, with the obvious intent of hoisting him over the parapet. His unexpected grip on the railing delayed this attempt just long enough to save him. Swept off his feet by the fury of the assault, he fell sideways against the barrier and had the good fortune to seize his enemy by the leg. Muffled in the sacking, it was vain to cry out, but he held furiously to the limb he had grasped, and he and his attacker rolled together on the footway. Aubrey was a powerful man, and even despite the surprise could probably have got the better of the situation. But as he wrestled desperately and tried to rid himself of his hood, a crashing blow fell upon his head, half stunning him. He lay sprawled out, momentarily incapable of struggle, yet conscious enough to expect, rather curiously, the dizzying sensation of a drop through insupportable air into the icy water of the East River. Hands seized him, and then, passively, he heard a shout, the sound of footsteps running on the planks, and other footsteps hurrying away at top speed. In a moment the sacking was torn from his head, and a friendly pedestrian was kneeling beside him. "Say, are you all right?" said the latter anxiously. "Gee, those guys nearly got you." Aubrey was too faint and dizzy to speak for a moment. His head was numb, and he felt certain that several inches of it had been caved in. Putting up his hand, feebly, he was surprised to find the contours of his skull much the same as usual. The stranger propped him against his knee and wiped away a trickle of blood with his handkerchief. "Say, old man, I thought you was a goner," he said sympathetically. "I seen those fellows jump you. Too bad they got away. Dirty work, I'll say so." Aubrey gulped the night air and sat up. The bridge rocked under him. Against the star-speckled sky, he could see the Woolworth building bending and jazzing like a poplar tree in a gale. He felt very sick. "Ever so much obliged to you," he stammered. "I'll be all right in a minute." "D'you want me to go and ring up an ambulance?" said his assistant. "No, no," said Aubrey. "I'll be all right." He staggered to his feet and clung to the rail of the bridge, trying to collect his wits. One phrase ran over and over in his mind with damnable iteration. "Mild, but they satisfy." "Where were you going?" said the other, supporting him. "Madison Avenue and 32nd. Maybe I can flag a jitney for you." "Here," he cried, as another citizen approached afoot. "Give this fellow a hand. Someone beat him over the bean with a club. I'm going to get him a lift." The newcomer readily undertook the friendly task and tied Aubrey's handkerchief round his head, which was bleeding freely. After a few moments, the first Samaritan succeeded in stopping a touring car which was speeding over from Brooklyn. The driver willingly agreed to take Aubrey home, and the other two helped him in. Barring a nasty gash on his scalp, he was none the worse. "A fellow needs a tin hat if he's going to wander round Long Island at night," said the motorist genially. "Two fellows tried to hold me up coming in from Rockville Center the other evening. Maybe they were the same two that picked on you. Did you get a look at them?" "No," said Aubrey. "That piece of sacking might have helped me trace them, but I forgot it. Want to run back for it?" "Never mind," said Aubrey. "I've got a hunch about this." "Think you know who it is? Maybe you're in politics, hey?" The car ran swiftly up the dark channel of the Bowery into 4th Avenue and turned off at 32nd Street to deposit Aubrey in front of his boarding house. He thanked his convoy heartily and refused further assistance. After several false shots, he got his latchkey in the lock, climbed 4 creaking flights, and stumbled into his room. Groping his way to the wash basin, he bathed his throbbing head, tied a towel round it, and fell into bed. Chapter 6. Titania learns the business. Although he kept late hours, Roger Mifflin was a prompt riser. It is only the very young who find satisfaction in lying abed in the morning. Those who approach the term of the 5th decade are sensitively aware of the fluency of life and have no taste to squander it among the blankets. The bookseller's morning routine was brisk and habitual. He was generally awakened about 7:30 by the jangling bell that balanced on a coiled spring at the foot of the stairs. This ringing announced the arrival of Becky, the old scrubwoman who came each morning to sweep out the shop and clean the floors for the day's traffic. Roger, in his old dressing gown of vermilion flannel, would scuffle down to let her in, picking up the milk bottles and the paper bag of baker's rolls at the same time. As Becky propped the front door wide, opened window transoms, and set about buffeting dust and tobacco smoke, Roger would take the milk and rolls back to the kitchen and give Bach a morning greeting. Bach would emerge from his literary kennel and thrust out his forelegs in a genial obeisance. This was partly politeness, and partly to straighten out his spine after its all-night curvature. Then Roger would let him out into the backyard for a run, himself standing on the kitchen steps to inhale the bright freshness of the morning air. This Saturday morning was clear and crisp. The plain backs of the homes along Whittier Street, irregular in profile as the margins of a free verse poem, offered Roger an agreeable human panorama. Thin strands of smoke were rising from chimneys. A belated baker's wagon was joggling down the alley. In bedroom bay windows, sheets and pillows were already set to sun and air. Brooklyn, admirable borough of homes and hearty breakfasts, attacks the morning hours in cheery, smiling spirit. Bach sniffed and rooted about the small backyard as though the earth, every cubic inch of which he already knew by rote, held some new entrancing flavor. Roger watched him with the amused and tender condescension one always feels toward a happy dog, perhaps the same mood of tolerant paternalism that God is said to have felt in watching his boisterous Hohenzollerns. The nipping air began to infiltrate his dressing gown, and Roger returned to the kitchen, his small, lively face alight with zest. He opened the drafts in the range, set a kettle on to boil, and went down to resuscitate the furnace. As he came upstairs for his bath, Mrs. Mifflin was descending, fresh and hearty in a starchy morning apron. Roger hummed a tune as he picked up the hairpins on the bedroom floor, and wondered to himself why women are always supposed to be more tidy than men. Titania was awake early. She smiled at the enigmatic portrait of Samuel Butler, glanced at the row of books over her bed, and dressed rapidly. She ran downstairs, eager to begin her experience as a bookseller. The first impression the Haunted Bookshop had made on her was one of superfluous dinginess, and as Mrs. Mifflin refused to let her help get breakfast, except set out the salt cellars, she ran down Gissing Street to a little florist's shop she had noticed the previous afternoon. Here she spent at least a week's salary in buying chrysanthemums and a large pot of white heather. She was distributing these about the shop when Roger found her. "Bless my soul," he said. "How are you going to live on your wages if you do that sort of thing? Payday doesn't come until next Friday." "Just one blowout," she said cheerfully. "I thought it would be fun to brighten the place up a bit. Think how pleased your floorwalker will be when he comes in." "Dear me," said Roger. "I hope you don't really think we have floorwalkers in the second-hand book business." After breakfast, he set about initiating his new employee into the routine of the shop. As he moved about, explaining the arrangement of his shelves, he kept up a running commentary. "Of course, all the miscellaneous information that a bookseller has to have will only come to you gradually," he said. "Such tags of bookshop lore as the difference between Philo Gubb and Philip Gibbs, Mrs. Wilson Woodrow and Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, and all that sort of thing. Don't be frightened by all the ads you see for a book called Bell and Wing, because no one was ever heard to ask for a copy. That's one of the reasons why I tell Mr. Gilbert I don't believe in advertising. Someone may ask you who wrote The Winning of the Best, and you'll have to know it wasn't Colonel Roosevelt but Mr. Ralph Waldo Trine. The beauty of being a bookseller is that you don't have to be a literary critic. All you have to do to books is enjoy them. A literary critic is the kind of fellow who will tell you that Wordsworth's Happy Warrior is a poem of 85 lines composed entirely of 2 sentences, one of 26 lines, and one of 59. What does it matter if Wordsworth wrote sentences almost as long as those of Walt Whitman or Mr. Will H. Hayes, if only he wrote a great poem? Literary critics are queer birds. There's Professor Phelps of Yale, for instance. He publishes a book in 1918 and calls it The Advance of English Poetry in the 20th Century. To my way of thinking, a book of that title oughtn't to be published until 2018. Then somebody will come along and ask you for a book of poems about a typewriter, and by you'll learn that what they want is Stevenson's Underwoods. Yes, it's a complicated life. Never argue with customers. Just give them the book they ought to have even if they don't know they want it. They went outside the front door, and Roger lit his pipe. In the little area in front of the shop windows stood large empty boxes supported on trestles. "The first thing I always do," he said. "The first thing you'll both do is catch your death of cold," said Helen over his shoulder. "Titania, you run and get your fur. Roger, go and find your cap. With your bald head, you ought to know better." When they returned to the front door, Titania's blue eyes were sparkling above her soft tippet. "I applaud your taste in furs," said Roger. "That is just the color of tobacco smoke." He blew a whiff against it to prove the likeness. He felt very talkative, as most older men do when a young girl looks as delightfully listenable as Titania. "What an adorable little place," said Titania, looking round at the bookshop space of private pavement, which was sunk below the street level. "You could put tables out here and serve tea in summertime." "The first thing every morning," continued Roger, "I set out the 10-cent stuff in these boxes. I take it in at night and stow it in these bins. When it rains, I shove out an awning, which is mighty good business. Someone is sure to take shelter and spend the time in looking over the books. A really heavy shower is often worth 50 or 60 cents. Once a week, I change my pavement stock. This week I've got mostly fiction out here. That's the sort of thing that comes in unlimited numbers. A good deal of it's tripe, but it serves its purpose." "Aren't they rather dirty?" said Titania doubtfully, looking at some little blue Rollo books, on which the siftings of generations had accumulated. "Would you mind if I dusted them off a bit?" "It's almost unheard of in the second-hand trade," said Roger, "but it might make them look better." Titania ran inside, borrowed a duster from Helen, and began house-cleaning the grimy boxes, while Roger chatted away in high spirits. Bach, already noticing the new order of things, squatted on the doorstep with an air of being a party to the conversation. Morning pedestrians on Gissing Street passed by, wondering who the bookseller's engaging assistant might be. "I wish could find a maid like that," thought a prosperous Brooklyn housewife on her way to market. "I must ring her up some day and find out how much she gets." Roger brought out armfuls of books while Titania dusted. "One of the reasons I'm awfully glad you've come here to help me," he said, "is that I'll be able to get out more. I've been so tied down by the shop, I haven't had a chance to scout round, buy up libraries, make bids on collections that are being sold, and all that sort of thing. My stock is running a bit low. If you just wait for what comes in, you don't get much of the really good stuff." Titania was polishing a copy of the late Mrs. Null. "It must be wonderful to have read so many books," she said. "I'm afraid I'm not a very deep reader, but at any rate Dad has taught me a respect for good books. He gets so mad because when my friends come to the house, and he asks them what they've been reading, the only thing they seem to know about is Dear Mabel." Roger chuckled. "I hope you don't think I'm a mere highbrow," he said. "As a customer said to me once, without meaning to be funny, I like both the Iliad and the Argosy. The only thing I can't stand is literature that is unfairly and intentionally flavored with vanilla. Confectionery soon disgusts the palate, whether you find it in Marcus Aurelius or Dr. Crane. There's an odd aspect of the matter that sometimes strikes me. Doc Crane's remarks are just as true as Lord Bacon's, so how is it that the doctor puts me to sleep in a paragraph, while my Lord's essays keep me awake all night?" Titania, being unacquainted with these philosophers, pursued the characteristic feminine course of clinging to the subject on which she was informed. The undiscerning have called this habit of mind irrelevant, but wrongly. The feminine intellect leaps like a grasshopper, the masculine plods as the ant. "I see there's a new Mabel book coming," she said. "It's called That's Me All Over Mabel, and the newsstand clerk at the Octagon says he expects to sell 1,000 copies." "Well, there's a meaning in that," said Roger. "People have a craving to be amused, and I'm sure I don't blame him. I'm afraid I haven't read Dear Mabel. If it's really amusing, I'm glad they read it. I suspect it isn't a very great book, because a Philadelphia schoolgirl has written a reply to it called Dear Bill, which is said to be as good as the original. Now you can hardly imagine a Philadelphia flapper writing an effective companion to Bacon's essays. But never mind, if the stuff's amusing, it has its place. The human yearning for innocent pastime is a pathetic thing, come to think about it. It shows what a desperately grim thing life has become. One of the most significant things I know is that breathless, expectant, adoring hush that falls over a theater at a Saturday matinee. When the house goes dark and the footlights set the bottom of the curtain in a glow, and the latecomers tank over your feet climbing into their seats. "Isn't it an adorable moment?" cried Titania. "Yes, it is," said Roger. "But it makes me sad to see what Tosh is handed out to that eager, expectant audience, most of the time. There they all are, ready to be thrilled, eager to be worked upon, deliberately putting themselves into that glorious, rare, receptive mood when they are clay in the artist's hand, and Lord, what miserable substitutes for joy and sorrow are put over on them. Day after day, I see people streaming into theaters and movies, and I know that more than half the time they are on a blind quest, thinking they are satisfied when in truth they are fed on paltry husks. And the sad part about it is that if you let yourself think you are satisfied with husks, you'll have no appetite left for the real grain." Titania wondered, a little panic-stricken, whether she had been permitting herself to be satisfied with husks. She remembered how greatly she had enjoyed a Dorothy Gish film a few evenings before. "But," she ventured, "you said people want to be amused. And if they laugh and look happy, surely they're amused?" "They only think they are," cried Mifflin. "They think they're amused because they don't know what real amusement is. Laughter and prayer are the two noblest habits of man. They mark us off from the brutes. To laugh at cheap jests is as base as to pray to cheap gods. To laugh at Fatty Arbuckle is to degrade the human spirit." Titania thought she was getting in rather deep, but she had the tenacious logic of every healthy girl. She said, "But a joke that seems cheap to you doesn't seem cheap to the person who laughs at it, or he wouldn't laugh." Her face brightened as a fresh idea flooded her mind. "The wooden image a savage prays to may seem cheap to you, but it's the best god he knows, and it's all right for him to pray to it." "Bully for you," said Roger. "Perfectly true, but I've got away from the point I had in mind. Humanity is yearning now as it never did before for truth, for beauty, for the things that comfort and console and make life seem worthwhile. I feel this all round me, every day. We've been through a frightful ordeal, and every decent spirit is asking itself what we can do to pick up the fragments and remold the world nearer to our heart's desire. Look here, here's something I found the other day in John Masefield's preface to one of his plays. The truth and rapture of man are holy things, not lightly to be scorned. A carelessness of life and beauty marks the glutton, the idler, and the fool in their deadly path across history. I tell you, I've done some pretty sober thinking as I've sat here in my bookshop during the past horrible years. Walt Whitman wrote a little poem during the Civil War. Year that trembled and reeled beneath me, said Walt, must I learn to chant the cold dirges of the baffled and sullen hymns of defeat. I've sat here in my shop at night and looked round at my shelves, looked at all the brave books that house the hopes and gentlenesses and dreams of men and women, and wondered if they were all wrong, discredited, defeated. Wondered if the world were still merely a jungle of fury. I think I'd have gone balmy if it weren't for Walt Whitman. Talk about Mr. Britling. Walt was the man who saw it through. The glutton, the idler, and the fool in their deadly path across history. A deadly path indeed. The German military men weren't idlers, but they were gluttons and fools to the nth power. Look at their deadly path. And look at other deadly paths, too. Look at our slums, jails, insane asylums. I used to wonder what I could do to justify my comfortable existence here during such a time of horror. What right had I to shirk in a quiet bookshop when so many men were suffering and dying through no fault of their own? I tried to get into an ambulance unit, but I've had no medical training, and they said they didn't want men of my age unless they were experienced doctors. I know how you felt, said Titania, with a surprising look of comprehension. Don't you suppose that a great many girls, who couldn't do anything real to help, got tired of wearing neat little uniforms with Sam Brown belts? Well, said Roger, it was a bad time. The war contradicted and denied everything I had ever lived for. Oh, I can't tell you how I felt about it. I can't even express it to myself. Sometimes I used to feel as I think that truly noble simpleton Henry Ford may have felt when he organized his peace voyage, that I would do anything, however stupid, to stop it all. In a world where everyone was so wise and cynical and cruel, it was admirable to find a man so utterly simple and hopeful as Henry. A boob, they called him. Well, I say bravo for boobs. I dare say most of the apostles were boobs, or maybe they called them Bolsheviks. Titania had only the vaguest notion about Bolsheviks, but she had seen a good many newspaper cartoons. I guess Judas was a Bolshevik, she said innocently. Yes, and probably George III called Ben Franklin a Bolshevik, retorted Roger. The trouble is, truth and falsehood don't come laid out in black and white, truth and untruth, as the wartime joke had it. Sometimes I thought truth had vanished from the earth, he cried bitterly. Like everything else, it was rationed by the governments. I taught myself to disbelieve half of what I read in the papers. I saw the world clawing itself to shreds in blind rage. I saw hardly anyone brave enough to face the brutalizing absurdity as it really was and describe it. I saw the glutton, the idler, and the fool applauding, while brave and simple men walked in the horrors of hell. The stay-at-home poets turned it to pretty lyrics of glory and sacrifice. Perhaps half a dozen of them have told the truth. Have you read Sassoon? Or Latsko's Men in War, which was so damn true that the government suppressed it? Humph, putting truth on rations. He knocked out his pipe against his heel, and his blue eyes shone with a kind of desperate earnestness. But I tell you, the world is going to have the truth about war. We're going to put an end to this madness. It's not going to be easy. Just now, in the intoxication of the German collapse, we're all rejoicing in our new happiness. I tell you, the real peace will be a long time coming. When you tear up all the fibers of civilization, it's a slow job to knit things together again. You see those children going down the street to school? Peace lies in their hands. When they are taught in school that war is the most loathsome scourge humanity is subject to, that it smirches and fouls every lovely occupation of the mortal spirit, then there may be some hope for the future. But I'd like to bet they are having it drilled into them that war is a glorious and noble sacrifice. The people who write poems about the divine frenzy of going over the top are usually those who dipped their pens a long, long way from the slimy duckboards of the trenches. It's funny how we hate to face realities. I knew a commuter once who rode in town every day on the 8.13, but he used to call it the 7.73. He said it made him feel more virtuous. There was a pause, while Roger watched some belated urchins hurrying toward school. I think any man would be a traitor to humanity who didn't pledge every effort of his waking life to an attempt to make war impossible in future. Surely no one would deny that, said Titania. But I do think the war was very glorious as well as very terrible. I've known lots of men who went over, knowing well what they were to face, and yet went gladly and humbly in the thought they were going for a true cause. A cause which is so true shouldn't need the sacrifice of millions of fine lives, said Roger gravely. Don't imagine I don't see the dreadful nobility of it. But poor humanity shouldn't be asked to be noble at such a cost. That's the most pitiful tragedy of it all. Don't you suppose the Germans thought they too were marching off for a noble cause when they began it and forced this misery on the world? They had been educated to believe so, for a generation. That's the terrible hypnotism of war, the brute mass impulse, the pride and national spirit, the instinctive simplicity of men that makes them worship what is their own above everything else. I've thrilled and shouted with patriotic pride, like everyone. Music and flags and men marching in step have bewitched me, as they do all of us. And then I've gone home and sworn to root this evil instinct out of my soul. God help us. Let's love the world, love humanity, not just our own country. That's why I'm so keen about the part we're going to play at the peace conference. Our motto over there will be America Last. Hurrah for us, I say, for we shall be the only nation over there with absolutely no axe to grind. Nothing but a pax to grind. It argued well for Titania's breadth of mind that she was not dismayed nor alarmed at the poor bookseller's anguished harangue. She surmised sagely that he was cleansing his bosom of much perilous stuff. In some mysterious way she had learned the greatest and rarest of the spirit's gifts, toleration. You can't help loving your country, she said. Let's go indoors, he answered. You'll catch cold out here. I want to show you my alcove of books on the war. Of course one can't help loving one's country, he added. I love mine so much that I want to see her take the lead in making a new era possible. She has sacrificed least for war. She should be ready to sacrifice most for peace. As for me, he said, smiling, I'd be willing to sacrifice the whole Republican Party. I don't see why you call the war an absurdity, said Titania. We had to beat Germany, or where would civilization have been? We had to beat Germany, yes, but the absurdity lies in the fact that we had to beat ourselves in doing it. The first thing you'll find, when the peace conference gets to work, will be that we shall have to help Germany onto her feet again so that she can be punished in an orderly way. We shall have to feed her and admit her to commerce so that she can pay her indemnities. We shall have to police her cities to prevent revolution from burning her up, and the upshot of it all will be that men will have fought the most terrible war in history and endured nameless horrors for the privilege of nursing their enemy back to health. If that isn't an absurdity, what is? That's what happens when a great nation like Germany goes insane. Well, we're up against some terribly complicated problems. My only consolation is that I think the bookseller can play as useful a part as any man in rebuilding the world's sanity. When I was fretting over what I could do to help things along, I came across 2 lines in my favorite poet that encouraged me. Good old George Herbert says, "A grain of glory mixed with humbleness cures both a fever and lethargicness." Certainly running a second-hand bookstore is a pretty humble calling, but I've mixed a grain of glory with it, in my own imagination at any rate. You see, books contain the thoughts and dreams of men, their hopes and strivings, and all their immortal parts. It's in books that most of us learn how splendidly worthwhile life is. I never realized the greatness of the human spirit, the indomitable grandeur of man's mind, until I read Milton's Areopagitica. To read that great outburst of splendid anger ennobles the meanest of us simply because we belong to the same species of animal as Milton. Books are the immortality of the race, the father and mother of most that is worth while cherishing in our hearts. To spread good books about, to sow them on fertile minds, to propagate understanding and a carefulness of life and beauty, isn't that high enough mission for a man? The bookseller is the real Mr. Valiant for truth. Here's my war alcove, he went on. I've stacked up here most of the really good books the war has brought out. If humanity has sense enough to take these books to heart, It will never get itself into this mess again. Printer's ink has been running a race against gunpowder these many, many years. Ink is handicapped in a way, because you can blow up a man with gunpowder in half a second, while it may take 20 years to blow him up with a book. But the gunpowder destroys itself along with its victim, while a book can keep on exploding for centuries. There's Hardy's Dynast, for example. When you read that book, you can feel it blowing up your mind. It leaves you gasping, ill, nauseated. Oh, it's not pleasant to feel some really pure intellect filtered into one's brain. It hurts. There's enough TNT in that book to blast war from the face of the globe. But there's a slow fuse attached to it. It hasn't really exploded yet. Maybe it won't for another 50 years. In regard to the war, think what books have accomplished. What was the first thing all the governments started to do? Publish books. Blue books, yellow books, white books, red books, everything but black books, which would have been appropriate in Berlin. They knew that guns and troops were helpless unless they could get the books on their side, too. Books did as much as anything else to bring America into the war. Some German books helped to wipe the Kaiser off his throne. I Accuse, and Dr. Muellen's magnificent outburst, The Vandal of Europe, and Lichnowsky's private memorandum, that shook Germany to her foundations, simply because he told the truth. Here's that book Men in War, written I believe by a Hungarian officer, with its noble dedication to friend and foe. Here are some of the French books, books in which the clear, passionate intellect of that race, with its savage irony, burns like a flame. Of course you've read Wells already. Everybody has. Of course you've read Wells already. Everybody has. How about the Americans? Said Titania. Haven't they written anything about the war that's worthwhile? Here's one that I found a lot of meat in, streaked with philosophical gristle, said Roger, relighting his pipe. He pulled out a copy of Professor Latimer's Progress. There was one passage that I remember marking. Let's see now. What was it? Yes, here. It is true that, if you made a poll of newspaper editors, you might find a great many who think that war is evil. But if you were to take a census among pastors of fashionable metropolitan churches, that's a bullseye hit. The church has done for itself with most thinking men. There's another good passage in Professor Latimer, where he points out the philosophical value of dishwashing. Some of Latimer's talk is so much in common with my ideas that I've been rather hoping he'd drop in here someday. I'd like to meet him. As for American poets, get wise to Edwin Robinson. There is no knowing how long the bookseller's monologue might have continued, but at this moment Helen appeared from the kitchen. "Good gracious, Roger," she exclaimed. "I've heard your voice piping away for I don't know how long. What are you doing, giving the poor child a Chautauqua lecture? You must want to frighten her out of the book business." Roger looked a little sheepish. "My dear," he said, "I was only laying down a few of the principles underlying the art of bookselling." "It was very interesting, honestly it was," said Titania brightly. Mrs. Mifflin, in a blue check apron and with plump arms flowery to the elbow, gave her a wink, or as near a wink as a woman ever achieves. Ask the man who owns one. "Whenever Mr. Mifflin feels very low in his mind about the business," she said, "he falls back on those highly idealized sentiments. He knows that next to being a parson, he's got into the worst line there is, and he tries bravely to conceal it from himself." "I think it's too bad to give me away before Miss Titania," said Roger, smiling. So Titania saw this was merely a family joke. "Really, truly," she protested, "I'm having a lovely time. I've been learning all about Professor Latimer, who wrote The Handle of Europe, and all sorts of things. I've been afraid every minute that some customer would come in and interrupt us." "No fear of that," said Helen. "They're scarce in the early morning." She went back to her kitchen. "Well, Miss Titania," resumed Roger, "you see what I'm driving at. I want to give people an entirely new idea about bookshops. The grain of glory that I hope will cure both my fever and my lethargicness is my conception of the bookstore as a powerhouse, a radiating place for truth and beauty. I insist books are not absolutely dead things. They are as lively as those fabulous dragons' teeth, and being sewn up and down, may chance to spring up armed men. How about Bernhardy? Some of my corn cob friends tell me books are just merchandise. Pshaw! I haven't read much of Bernard Shaw, said Titania. Did you ever notice how books track you down and hunt you out? They follow you like the hound in Francis Thompson's poem. They know their quarry. Look at that book, The Education of Henry Adams. Just watch the way it's hounding out thinking people this winter. And The Four Horsemen, you can see it racing in the veins of the reading people. It's one of the uncanniest things I know to watch a real book on its career. It follows you and drives you into a corner and makes you read it. There's a queer old book that's been chasing me for years, The Life and Opinions of John Buncle, ESQ, it's called. I've tried to escape it, but every now and then it sticks up its head somewhere. It'll get me someday, and I'll be compelled to read it. 10,000 a year trailed me the same way until I surrendered. Words can't describe the cunning of some books. You'll think you've shaken them off your trail, and then one day some innocent-looking customer will pop in and begin to talk, and you'll know he's an unconscious agent of book destiny. There's an old sea captain who drops in here now and then. He's simply the novels of Captain Marryat put into flesh. He has me under a kind of spell. I know I shall have to read Peter Simple before I die, just because the old fellow loves it so. That's why I call this place the Haunted Bookshop. Haunted by the ghosts of the books I haven't read. Poor uneasy spirits, they walk and walk around me. There's only one way to lay the ghost of a book, and that is to read it. I know what you mean, said Titania. I haven't read much Bernard Shaw, but I feel I shall have to. He meets me at every turn, bullying me. And I know lots of people who are simply terrorized by H.G. Wells. Every time one of his books comes out, and that's pretty often, they're in a perfect panic until they've read it. Roger chuckled. Some have even been stampeded into subscribing to the New Republic for that very purpose. But speaking of the Haunted Bookshop, what's your special interest in that Oliver Cromwell book? Oh, I'm glad you mentioned it, said Roger. I must put it back in its place on the shelf. He ran back to the den to get it, and just then the bell clanged at the door. A customer came in, and the one-sided gossip was over for the time being. Chapter 7. Aubrey Takes Lodgings. I am sensible that Mr. Aubrey Gilbert is by no means ideal as the leading juvenile of our piece. The time still demands some explanation why the leading juvenile wears no gold chevrons on his left sleeve. As a matter of fact, our young servant of the Gray Matter Agency had been declined by a recruiting station and a draft board on account of flat feet. Although I must protest that their flatness detracts not at all from his outward bearing, nor from his physical capacity in the ordinary concerns of amiable youth. When the Army turned him down flat, as he put it, he had entered the service of the Committee on Public Information and had carried on mysterious activities in their behalf for over a year, up to the time when the armistice was signed by the United Press. Owing to a small error of judgment on his part, now completely forgotten, but due to the regrettable delay of the German envoys to synchronize with over-exuberant press correspondence, the last 3 days of the war had been carried on without his active assistance. After the natural recuperation necessary on the 12th of November, he had been reabsorbed by the Gray Matter Advertising Agency, with whom he had been connected for several years, and where his sound and vivacious qualities were highly esteemed. It was in the course of drumming up post-war business that he had swung so far out of his ordinary orbit as to call on Roger Mifflin. Perhaps these explanations should have been made earlier. At any rate, Aubrey woke that Saturday morning, about the time Titania began to dust the pavement boxes, in no very world-conquering humor. As it was a half-holiday, he felt no compunction in staying away from the office. The landlady, a motherly soul, sent him up some coffee and scrambled eggs, and insisted on having a doctor in to look at his damage. Several stitches were taken, after which he had a nap. He woke up at noon, feeling better, though his head still ached abominably. Putting on a dressing gown, he sat down in his modest chamber, which was furnished chiefly with a pipe rack, ashtrays, and a set of O. Henry, and picked up one of his favorite volumes for a bit of solace. We have hinted that Mr. Gilbert was not what is called literary. His reading was mostly of the newsstand sort and printer's ink, that naive journal of the publicity professions. His favorite diversion was luncheon at the advertising club, where he would pore, fascinated, over displays of advertising booklets, posters, and pamphlets with such titles as Tell Your Story in boldface. He was accustomed to remark that the fellow who writes the Packard ads has Ralph Waldo Emerson skinned 3 ways from the jack. Yet much must be forgiven this young man for his love of O. Henry. He knew, what many other happy souls have found, that O. Henry is one of those rare and gifted tellers of tales who can be read at all times. No matter how weary, how depressed, how shaken in morale, one can always find enjoyment in that master romancer of the Cabarabian Nights. Don't talk to me of Dickens' Christmas stories, Aubrey said to himself, recalling his adventure in Brooklyn. I'll bet O. Henry's gift of the Magi beats anything Dick ever laid pen to. What a shame he died without finishing that Christmas story in Rolling Stones. I wish some boss writer like Irvin Cobb or Edna Ferber would take a hand at finishing it. If I were an editor, I'd hire someone to wind up that yarn. It's a crime to have a good story like that lying around half-written. He was sitting in a soft wreath of cigarette smoke when his landlady came in with the morning paper. Thought you might like to see the Times, Mr. Gilbert, she said. I knew you'd been too sick to go out and buy one. I see the president's going to sail on Wednesday. Aubrey threaded his way through the news with the practiced eye of one who knows what interests him. Then, by force of habit, he carefully scanned the advertising pages. A notice in the Help Wanted columns leaped out at him. Wanted, for temporary employment at Hotel Octagon, 3 chefs, 5 experienced cooks, 20 waiters. Apply chef's office, 11 p.m. Tuesday. He thought. I suppose, to take the place of those fellows who are going to sail on the George Washington to cook for Mr. Wilson. That's a grand ad for the Octagon, having their kitchen staff chosen for the president's trip. Gee, I wonder why they don't play that up in some real space. Maybe I can place some copy for them along that line. An idea suddenly occurred to him, and he went over to the chair where he had thrown his overcoat the night before. From the pocket he took out the cover of Carlyle's Cromwell and looked at it carefully. I wonder what the jinx is on this book, he thought. It's a queer thing the way that fellow trailed me last night, then my finding this in the drugstore, and getting that crack on the bean. I wonder if that neighborhood is a safe place for a girl to work in. He paced up and down the room, forgetting the pain in his head. Maybe I ought to tip the police off about this business, he thought. It looks wrong to me, but I have a hankering to work the thing out on my own. I'd have a wonderful stand-in with old man Chapman if I saved that girl from anything. I've heard of gangs of kidnappers. No, I don't like the looks of things a little bit. I think that bookseller is half-cracked, anyway. He doesn't believe in advertising. The idea of Chapman trusting his daughter in a place like that. The thought of playing knight-errant to something more personal and romantic than an advertising account was irresistible. I'll slip over to Brooklyn as soon as it gets dark this evening, he said to himself. I ought to be able to get a room somewhere along that street, where I can watch that bookshop without being seen, and find out what's haunting it. I've got that old .22 pop gun of mine that I used to use up at camp. I'll take it along. I'd like to know more about Weintraub's drugstore, too. I didn't fancy the map of her Weintraub, not at all. To tell the truth, I had no idea old man Carlyle would get mixed up in anything as interesting as this. He found a romantic exhilaration in packing a handbag, pajamas, hairbrushes, toothbrush, toothpaste. What an ad it would be for the Chinese paste people, he thought, if they knew I was taking a tube of their stuff on this adventure. His .22 revolver, a small green box of cartridges of the size commonly used for squirrel shooting, a volume of O. Henry, a safety razor and adjuncts, a pad of writing paper, at least 6 nationally advertised articles, he said to himself, enumerating his kit. He locked his bag, dressed, and went downstairs for lunch. After lunch he lay down for a rest, as his head was still very painful, but he was not able to sleep. The thought of Titania Chapman's blue eyes and gallant little figure came between him and slumber. He could not shake off the conviction that some peril was hanging over her. Again and again he looked at his watch, rebuking the lagging dusk. At 4:30 he set off for the subway. Halfway down 33rd Street a thought struck him. He returned to his room, got out a pair of opera glasses from his trunk, and put them in his bag. It was blue twilight when he reached Gissing Street. The block between Wordsworth Avenue and Hazlitt Street is peculiar in that on one side, the side where the Haunted Bookshop stands, The old brownstone dwellings have mostly been replaced by small shops of a bright, lively character. At the Wordsworth Avenue corner, where the L swings round in a lofty roaring curve, stands Weintraub's drug store. Below it, on the western side, a succession of shining windows beacon through the evening. Delicatessen shops with their appetizing medley of cooked and pickled meats, dried fruits, cheeses, and bright-colored jars of preserves. Small modistes with generously contoured wax busts of coiffured ladies. Lunchrooms with the day's menu typed and pasted on the outer pane. A French rotisserie where chickens turn hissing on the spits before a tall oven of rosy coals. Florists, tobacconists, fruit dealers, and a Greek candy shop with a long soda fountain shining with onyx marble and colored glass lamps and nickel tanks of hot chocolate. A stationery shop, now stuffed for the holiday trade with Christmas cards, toys, calendars, and those queer little suede-bound volumes of Kipling, Service, Oscar Wilde, and Omar Khayyam that appear every year toward Christmas time. Such modest and cheerful merchandising makes the western pavement of Gissing Street a jolly place when the lights are lit. All the shops were decorated for the Christmas trade. The Christmas issues of the magazines were just out and brightened the newsstands with their glowing covers. This section of Brooklyn has a tone and atmosphere peculiarly French in some parts. One can quite imagine oneself in some smaller Parisian boulevard frequented by the petit bourgeois. Midway in this engaging and animated block stands the Haunted Bookshop. Aubrey could see its windows lit, and the shelved masses of books within. He felt a severe temptation to enter, but a certain bashfulness added itself to his desire to act in secret. There was a privy exhilaration in his plan of putting the bookshop under an unsuspected surveillance, and he had the emotion of one walking on the frontiers of adventure. So he kept on the opposite side of the street, which still maintains an unbroken row of quiet brown fronts, save for the movie theater at the upper corner, opposite Weintraub's. Some of the basements on this side are occupied now by small tailors, laundries, and lace curtain cleaners. Lace curtains are still a fetish in Brooklyn, but most of the houses are still merely dwellings. Carrying his bag, Aubrey passed the bright halo of the movie theater. Posters announcing the return of Tarzan showed a kind of third chapter of Genesis seen with an Eve in a sports suit. Added attraction, Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Drew, he read. A little way down the block he saw a sign vacancies in a parlor window. The house was nearly opposite the bookshop, and he at once mounted the tall steps to the front door and rang. A fawn-tinted colored girl, of the kind generally called Addie, arrived presently. "Can I get a room here?" he asked. "I don't know. You'd better see Miss Schiller," she said, without rancor. Adopting the customary compromise of untrained domestics, she did not invite him inside, but departed, leaving the door open to show that there was no ill will. Aubrey stepped into the hall and closed the door behind him. In an immense mirror, the pale cheese-colored flutter of a gas jet was remotely reflected. He noticed the Landseer engraving hung against wallpaper designed in facsimile of large rectangles of gray stone, and the usual telephone memorandum for the usual Mrs. J. F. Smith, who abides in all lodging houses, tucked into the frame of the mirror. "Will Mrs. Smith please call Stockton 6771, it said. A carpeted stair with a fine old mahogany balustrade rose into the dimness. Aubrey, who was thoroughly familiar with lodgings, knew instinctively that the 4th, 9th, 10th, and 14th steps would be creakers. A soft musk sweetened the warm, torpid air. He divined that someone was toasting marshmallows over a gas jet. He knew perfectly well that somewhere in the house would be a placard over a bathtub with the legend, "Please leave this tub as you would wish to find it." Roger Mifflin would have said, after studying the hall, that someone in the house was sure to be reading the poems of Rabbi Tagore. But Aubrey was not so caustic. Mrs. Schiller came up the basement stairs, followed by a small pug dog. She was warm and stout, with a tendency to burst just under the armpits. She was friendly. The pug made merry over Aubrey's ankles. "Stop it, treasure," said Mrs. Schiller. "Can I get a room here?" asked Aubrey with great politeness. "Third floor front's the only thing I've got," she said. "You don't smoke in bed, do you?" The last young man I had burned holes in 3 of my sheets. Aubrey reassured her. "I don't give meals." "That's all right," said Aubrey. "Suits me." $5 a week, she said. "May I see it?" Mrs. Schiller brightened the gas and led the way upstairs. Treasure skipped up the treads beside her. The sight of the 6 feet ascending together amused Aubrey. The 4th, 9th, 10th, and 14th steps creaked, as he had guessed they would. On the landing of the second story, a transom gushed orange light. Mrs. Schiller was secretly pleased at not having to augment the gas on that landing. Under the transom and behind a door, Aubrey could hear someone having a bath, with a great sloshing of water. He wondered irreverently whether it was Mrs. J. F. Smith. At any rate, he felt sure, it was some experienced habitué of lodgings, who knew that about 5:30 in the afternoon is the best time for a bath, before cooking supper and the homecoming ablutions of other tenants have exhausted the hot water boiler. They climbed one more flight. The room was small, occupying half the third-floor frontage. A large window opened onto the street, giving a plain view of the bookshop and the other houses across the way. A washstand stood modestly inside a large cupboard. Over the mantel was the familiar picture, usually, however, reserved for the fourth floor back, of a young lady having her shoes shined by a ribald small boy. Aubrey was delighted. "This is fine," he said. "Here's a week in advance." Mrs. Schiller was almost disconcerted by the rapidity of the transaction. She preferred to solemnize the reception of a new lodger by a little more talk, remarks about the weather, the difficulty of getting help, the young women guests who empty tea leaves down wash basin pipes, and so on. All this sort of gossip, apparently aimless, has a very real purpose. It enables the defenseless landlady to size up the stranger who comes to prey upon her. She had hardly had a good look at this gentleman, nor even knew his name, and here he had paid a week's rent and was already installed. Aubrey divined the cause of her hesitation and gave her his business card. "All right, Mr. Gilbert," she said. "I'll send up the girl with some clean towels and a latchkey." Aubrey sat down in a rocking chair by the window, tucked the muslin curtain to one side, and looked out upon the bright channel of Gissing Street. He was full of the exhilaration that springs from any change of abode, but his romantic satisfaction in being so close to the adorable Titania was somewhat marred by a sense of absurdity, which is feared by young men more than wounds and death. He could see the lighted windows of the Haunted Bookshop quite plainly, but he could not think of any adequate excuse for going over there. And already he realized that to be near Miss Chapman was not at all the consolation he had expected it would be. He had a powerful desire to see her. He turned off the gas, lit his pipe, opened the window, and focused the opera glasses on the door of the bookshop. It brought the place tantalizingly near. He could see the table at the front of the shop, Roger's bulletin board under the electric light, and one or two nondescript customers gleaning along the shelves. Then something bounded violently under the third button of his shirt. There she was. In the bright, prismatic little circle of the lenses he could see Titania, heavenly creature, in her white V-necked blouse and brown skirt. There she was looking at a book. He saw her put out one arm and caught the twinkle of her wristwatch. In the startling familiarity of the magnifying glass he could see her bright, unconscious face, the merry profile of her cheek and chin. "The idea of that girl working in a second-hand bookstore," he exclaimed. "It's positive sacrilege. Old man Chapman must be crazy." He took out his pajamas and threw them on the bed, put his toothbrush and razor on the wash basin, laid hairbrushes and Henry on the bureau. Feeling rather serious-comic, he loaded his small revolver and hipped it. It was 6 o'clock, and he wound his watch. He was a little uncertain what to do. Whether to keep a vigil at the window with the opera glasses, or go down in the street where he could watch the bookshop more nearly. In the excitement of the adventure, he had forgotten all about the cut on his scalp and felt quite chipper. In leaving Madison Avenue, he had attempted to excuse the preposterousness of his excursion by thinking that a quiet weekend in Brooklyn would give him an opportunity to jot down some tentative ideas for Daintybit's advertising copy which he planned to submit to his chief on Monday. But now that he was here, he felt the impossibility of attacking any such humdrum task. How could he sit down in cold blood to devise any attention-compelling layouts for Daintybits tapioca and Chapman's cherished Saratoga chips, when the daintiest bit of all was only a few yards away. For the first time was made plain to him the amazing power of young women to interfere with the legitimate commerce of the world. He did get so far as to take out his pad of writing paper and jot down Chapman's cherished chips. These delicate wafers, crisped by a secret process, cherish in their unique tang and flavor all the life-giving nutriment that has made the potato the king of vegetables. But the face of Miss Titania kept coming between his hand and brain. Of what avail to flood the world with Chapman chips if the girl herself should come to any harm? Was this the face that launched 1,000 chips? He murmured, and for an instant wished he had brought the Oxford Book of English Verse instead of O. Henry. A tap sounded at his door, and Mrs. Schiller appeared. "Telephone for you, Mr. Gilbert," she said. "For me?" said Aubrey in amazement. How could it be for him, he thought, for no one knew he was there. The party on the wire asked to speak to the gentleman who arrived about half an hour ago, and I guess you must be the one he means. "Did he say who he is?" asked Aubrey. "No, sir." For a moment Aubrey thought of refusing to answer the call. Then it occurred to him that this would arouse Mrs. Schiller's suspicions. He ran down to the telephone, which stood under the stairs in the front hall. "Hello," he said. "Is this the new guest?" said a voice, a deep, gargling kind of voice. "Yes," said Aubrey. "Is this the gentleman that arrived half an hour ago with a handbag?" "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm a friend," said the voice. "I wish you well." "How do you do, friend and well-wisher?" said Aubrey genially. "I just want to warn you that Gissing Street is not healthy for you," said the voice. "Is that so?" said Aubrey sharply. "Who are you?" "I am a friend," buzzed the receiver. There was a harsh bass note in the voice that made the diaphragm at Aubrey's ear vibrate tinnily. Aubrey grew angry. "Well, Herr Freund," he said, "if you're the well-wisher I met on the bridge last night, watch your step. I've got your number." There was a pause. Then the other repeated, ponderously, "I am a friend. Gissing Street is not healthy for you." There was a click, and he had rung off. Aubrey was a good deal perplexed. He returned to his room and sat in the dark by the window, smoking a pipe and thinking, with his eyes on the bookshop. There was no longer any doubt in his mind that something sinister was afoot. He reviewed in memory the events of the past few days. It was on Monday that a book-loving friend had first told him of the existence of the shop on Gissing Street. On Tuesday evening he had gone round to visit the place, and had stayed to supper with Mr. Mifflin. On Wednesday and Thursday he had been busy at the office, and the idea of an intensive Daintybit campaign in Brooklyn had occurred to him. On Friday he had dined with Mr. Chapman, and had run into a curious string of coincidences. He tabulated them. 1. The lost ad in the Times on Friday morning. 2. The chef in the elevator carrying the book that was supposed to be lost, he being the same man Aubrey had seen in the bookshop on Tuesday evening. 3. Seeing the chef again on Gissing Street. 4. The return of the book to the bookshop. 5. Mifflin had said that the book had been stolen from him. Then why should it be either advertised or returned? 6. The rebinding of the book. 7. Finding the original cover of the book in Weintraub's drugstore. 8. The affair on the bridge. 9. The telephone message from a friend with an obviously Teutonic voice. He remembered the face of anger and fear displayed by the Octagon chef when he had spoken to him in the elevator. Until this oddly menacing telephone message, he could have explained the attack on the bridge as merely a haphazard footpad enterprise. But now he was forced to conclude that it was in some way connected with his visits to the bookshop. He felt, too, that in some unknown way Weintraub's drugstore had something to do with it. Would he have been attacked if he had not taken the book cover from the drugstore? He got the cover out of his bag and looked at it again. It was of plain blue cloth, with the title stamped in gold on the back, and at the bottom the lettering London, Chapman and Hall. From the width of the backstrap, it was evident that the book had been a fat one. Inside the front cover the figure 60 was written in red pencil. This he took to be Roger Mifflin's price mark. Inside the back cover he found the following notations. Volume 3, 166, 174, 210, 329, 349, 329 FFCFW. W. These references were written in black ink, in a small, neat hand. Below them, in quite a different script and in pale violet ink, was written 153, 3, 1, 2. I suppose these are page numbers, Aubrey thought. I think I'd better have a look at that book. He put the cover in his pocket and went out for a bite of supper. It's a puzzle with 3 sides to it, he thought, as he descended the crepitant stairs, the bookshop, the octagon, and Weintraub's. But that book seems to be the clue to the whole business.